What's the most you ever lost on a coin toss?
Sir?
The most you ever lost on a coin toss?
I don't know. I couldn't say.
Call it.
Call it.
Yes.
For what?
Just call it.
Well, we need to know what we're calling it for here.
You need to call it. I can't call it for you. Well, it wouldn't be fair.
I didn't put nothing up.
Yes, you did. You've been putting it up your whole life. You just didn't know it. You know what date is on this coin. It's been traveling 22 years to get here. But now it's here. And it's in the heads of tails.
Look, I need to know what I stand to win.
You stand to win everything. Call it.
It's Britney, bitch.
And Iraq, everywhere like such as.
I'm supposed to be the franchise player, and we're in here talking about practice.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Out, Charlie! Out!
Our next door neighbors are foreign countries.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Hey, everybody. My name is Ben. With me, as always, is my co-host, Giordano.
Hello. My name is Giordano, and I'm here to host the podcast, which is called Remember Shuffle. Thank you for that introduction.
And today we are joined by returning Remember Shuffle guest, Isaac. Say hi, Isaac.
Well, howdy, y'all.
And today we will be discussing the 2000 election, an episode that we have been looking forward to for a very long time. But before we get down to business, it's a bit of a milestone for us. This is going to be our 50th episode, and it will be dropping 2 years after we dropped our first episode. So, time to gloat.
Mazel.
We have allotted 3 minutes for gloating time.
Well, this calls for a celebration. I will.
Yeah, I mean, I never thought we'd make it to 50, I don't think, but it's been fun.
And we are so grateful for anyone who's been listening since the beginning, for anyone who came in later and then, like a true psychopath, listened to our backlog. We are so grateful for everyone who's given us their time. We know that there's a million podcasts out there, and the fact that you choose to listen to ours and write nice comments or mean comments.
Increasingly recently.
It makes our day. Giordano and I semi-ironically, but mostly sincerely say we love new episode drop day. We get to see the line go up. We get to see the plays go up. We get to hear about how we're wrong. It's just a good time all around. So this is where if we had revenue, I would say something like, we got the best job in the world. But as many people have pointed out, we don't have a Patreon yet. So I want you to hang on to those $5 a month for bonus content for later.
Someone accused us recently of not having a Patreon because we lived in socialist Canada. And it's actually because of protectionist America that we can't have a Patreon.
There's an entertainer visa called the O visa. The O stands for outstanding. And Uncle Sam has deemed us not special enough boys. We are not outstanding enough.
You guys don't get the OVO visa?
That would be sweet. The Draco-Wish Foundation visa. I just wanted to make a quick note. One more thing to say about our 2-year anniversary, which is that we talk a lot about the algorithm on this podcast and how it's bad. And Ben and I came to a realization recently that actually like a significant part of our podcast is determined by the algorithm, because we often choose topics based on like what does best if you look at the numbers. And someone pointed out to us that this is listening to the algorithm. And it's funny because I think the episode that started doing really well, that we started pivoting towards this strategy, was the Star Wars reboots episode. We're like, oh shit, we should choose topics like this, which is just funny because we always talk about how like it's so shitty that they're rebooting Star Wars because the algorithm told them to. But now our podcast strategy is to talk about the Star Wars reboots because the algorithm told us to do that.
Yeah, give the people what they want, and the people want slop sometimes.
Yeah, and you know what else the people want? Elections and politics.
Yes.
From 25 years ago.
Yes. But this is a great segue into our hook, why would you talk about a 25-year-old election?
Well, Isaac came on for one of our very popular politics episodes. You may remember Isaac from our Daily Show episode and as the host of Coexist Inc., an excellent podcast that I listen to, so please check that out and check out our Daily Show episode.
There's a lot of overlap between that Daily Show and what we're about to talk about now, I'd say.
The Straight Talk Express will be back, folks. John McCain's Straight Talk Express.
Yeah, so the reason to talk about the 2000 election, I mean, there's a few. First off, it's obviously the most consequential election for our time period because it's the one that gives us, controversially, the Bush administration. It leads very directly to the war on terror and the war in Iraq. And depending on who you believe did 9/11, leads to 9/11. I'm just going to nip a little something in the bud from our guest.
Yeah, Lieberman did 9/11. I just want you guys to know.
But I think the more interesting reason to talk about this election is to look at it without the hindsight of what is coming in the form of 9/11 and the war on terror. Because this was the snooze fest neoliberal consensus election where both of the parties are trying to ape Bill Clinton policies generally. I distinctly remember being a 10-year-old and downloading on file sharing the Rage Against the Machine video Testify, which was about how the two parties are the same.
I support the death penalty. I support the death penalty.
We will be prosperous if we embrace free trade.
Prosperity from free and fair trade.
Invest your money for the future.
Invest in the future.
I've been talking about clean air.
We got to clean up our air.
I support a ban on soft money.
We will get all of the soft money out of the campaign.
God bless you.
God bless you.
You may hear it called the two-party duopoly, or if you're Marjorie Taylor Greene, you're going to call it the mono-party, but I think those are two slightly different things. Everyone has forgotten the fucking snooze fest because it has this incredibly dramatic finish with the 537 votes in Florida and the hanging chads and the Bush v. Gore in the Supreme Court and all that shit, which we'll get to several hours from now. That contrast between who gives a shit, let's flip a coin, and then the closest election ever with a constitutional crisis to boot is something that's interesting and definitely worth digging down into.
And so, yeah, we'll talk about this neoliberal consensus, but also this is an important election because it gives us these contemporary Democrats, which never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I think that they often feel like a party that's like, their whole thing is that they're trying to have your interests at heart, but they're failing to do it. Like they're the official opposition always. And there are a lot of similarities between the way that Gore tried to not have this election stolen from him to what happened recently with the Roe v. Wade being overturned, right? Where the Democrats are just holding their hands up going, can you believe these guys? And offering you nothing in the way of an actual strategy to counteract this,
no,
right?
Giordano, you're not. They offer you the chance to support a noble loser.
Yes, exactly. That's what they have to offer you. And that's what Al Gore is in this election. He's a noble loser.
He went the distance, Giordano. He didn't win, but he went the distance. And he's Rocky.
Yeah.
I'm just happy that the Democratic Party is no longer like that at all. What you're saying right now doesn't describe the modern Democratic Party in the slightest. So
no, they're not going to pack the courts because it's undemocratic. They're not going to offer you anything in the way of an actual strategy that matches the Republicans. They love to be the losers. And I really think that this election is where I start to see it embodied in the most modern sense.
And I think it's fascinating if you compare it to Clinton, where the worst thing you could say about Clinton is that he's a child. The second worst thing you can say about Bill Clinton is that he was the first destroyer. He and, Tony Blair and the whole new left of the 1980s really destroyed the left in the countries they were in. And he's the one who came up with triangulation, where we are going to take a fundamentally right-wing party like welfare reform. We're going to do it, but we're going to do it smaller. And we're going to put a little progressive sheen on it so that we're essentially doing what they would do, but at a smaller scale. And if we do this, we will have power, right? And the worst version of this is that you are still doing centrism, but now you don't even have power because you let them steal the election from you in 2000.
You make this great sacrifice and you gained nothing from it.
Leading up to the 2000 election, I mean, I was young. I was like 10 years old or something like that when the Lewinsky stuff first started coming out. And politics to me at that very young age was tabloid politics. It was never politics. policy. I don't remember policy figuring into the cultural imagination at that point either.
Yeah, it's because these parties don't really have any ideological differences at this time. It comes down to mostly like, who are these two men? And that's what George Bush was running on, was I'm this guy, but my fly will be all the way up. Pretty explicit. I think he even said that explicitly, right? We've got to this convergence in the parties, and so it's like they don't have anything to distinguish themselves on ideological grounds at all. It's just the tabloid differences. So yeah, here's our roadmap for the episode. We're going to talk about the status quo that this election was happening in, this period of late 90s prosperity, because we get some quotes from the candidates that are so different compared to now. And then we'll talk about the important people from this election, people like Al Gore, George Bush, and Jeb Bush. And then we'll cover the primaries, including the Reform Party, which will be very important because this is Donald Trump's first serious attempt to run for president. Then we'll cover the campaign, including the conventions. And finally, the election apocalypse of Bush v. Gore, which is the part that you usually see covered in podcasts and books on this topic. So we'll finish off with that. And then, as always, we'll talk about the themes of the election and our echoes in the culture.
Yes, let's start. It's 1999, baby. Prince is doing that song on New Year's Eve as an ironic bit. We're zooming back. No one on this Zoom call's balls had dropped yet. It was a simpler time.
Whoa. You should ask first, okay?
And this quote stood out for me. This is from the big dog himself, Bill Clinton, from a joint Clinton-Gore campaign event. He said, Jernell, you have a better Clinton. Do you want to read it for me?
In my whole lifetime, there has never been a time when America had this much prosperity, this much social progress, and this much national confidence, with the absence of crisis at home or a threat abroad.
We're now approaching our final destination, Itchy and Scratchy Land, the amusement park of the future where nothing can possibly go wrong. Possibly go wrong. That's the first thing that's ever gone wrong.
To remind everyone, in 2016, when Donald Trump was inaugurated as president, his speech was called American Carnage. This president just went up there and was like, guys, everything is great.
Yeah. The national motto is nothing bad will ever happen to us.
Yeah, not to get Sorkin-y with the numbers, but there is a surplus that is projected to hit $5 trillion in the next 10 years. Or as I like to call it, 1 2/3 Iraq war worth of surplus. The country is at peace, crime is at a historic low, and the parties are converging on this neoliberal ideology. The Dems, they're doing welfare reform. This is the point where the Republicans are running the Congress and Bill Clinton is in the White House. And he's just compromising left, right, and center. But there's some kind of tech boom going on. There's some kind of .com thing that's going great, and everything is fine, and nothing will ever go wrong.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
But I would say, and this will be important for 2000 and ongoing, there are some murmurings of discontent. There are some cracks in the facade of this beautiful neoliberal dream. Real politics heads will remember that in 92 and 96, you have Ross Perot with his most successful third-party run in recent history. He gets almost 20% of the vote in 92 and then almost 10 in 96. So it's wild to think about how a third party maybe almost could have been born in this moment, because there are cracks in this information economy facade. And this is something I want to just signpost for later, but this idea of what I think of as stillborn American third parties that can never quite get there. What we get instead is this outsider energy redirected into the two-party system in figures like Hope and Change Obama or eventually MAGA Trump or whatever. But it will never actually be redirected into something new. It's always going to be channeled back into what we already have. So that's where we're at.
The end of herstory.
And I think you can see this end of history manifesting itself in the way that Gore chooses Lieberman as his running mate. Lieberman, also the guy that John McCain was considering as his running mate. This is a sense that there is this broad consensus that the two parties have agreed on, to the point where both parties are considering the same running mate.
Centrist hawk who hates fun. Get him on the ticket.
Yeah. Should we move on to our characters?
Yeah, dramatis personae, if you're feeling fancy in Latin.
So let's talk about the big dog himself.
No, the big dog is Bill. It's Bill Clinton.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, we need a different nickname for W.
The pretzel choker.
Yeah, there we go.
The big pretzel choker himself, W.
Maybe my favorite W quote that I found in a book that we did for research on this. In W's own words, he chased a lot of pussy and drank a lot of whiskey in his 20s.
But he's reformed now. You know, he's an evangelical.
Yeah, at 40. At 40, he gave up drinking and became a born-again Christian.
And this was one of the things that he was offering Clinton voters, was this idea that, hey, well, this is a quote that you found from George W. Bush, that he literally said, the times, they just don't call for major changes, which is one of the worst Bob Dylan remixes I think I've heard.
Yeah, the GOP is faced with this problem that Clinton and the Clinton economy is popular. Some people might not like the blowjob scandals or any of the other scandals, but there's not that much that people are mad about. So their solution is to find this nothing, this hollow man in the form of George W. Bush, and to put him on the ticket because he's going to have all the same policies, but he won't be doing Me Too stuff in the Oval Office with his intern. It really does kind of remind me of Biden running on nothing will fundamentally change to alleviate people.
And if I remember correctly, George Bush, when he ran, was much less hawkish than his opponent McCain, which was also kind of a bizarre position to take as a Republican.
He was less hawkish than Gore in the debates. Isaac, you hit the nail on the head when you said it was tabloid politics. If it's just about style over substance and it's going to be Bush v. Gore, you got to give advantage Bush. It's like, if we're talking style over substance, he is the cool jock. He's charming. And I feel like everyone kind of knows that he has a connection to oil because he failed as an oil man and Poppy was a successful oil man. And everyone knows he was probably governor of Texas. But my favorite W stories are about his stint owning the Texas Rangers, where he chipped in $600K to a $75 million bid and he owned the Rangers for a little while. And he turned this into so much political capital by being a hands-on everyman style guy. So he attends the games, he sits right below the dugout. He chats with the beer vendors. He pisses in the same urinals as the fans. Couldn't imagine any other politician pissing next to you.
Would you have stood next to him and like copped a look, you think? Look over a little bit, see what's he packing, huh? What's Bush packing?
Yeah. Ben's point here is that the ways that George Bush would become a successful politician, you can see that in the way that he's running the Texas Rangers, right? So he's doing the same persona that he'll do when he's running for office and mostly as a president.
And you know what you don't hear about him doing? Making any ownership decisions. For the most part. You don't hear about him negotiating deals or trading players. He's going to let the nerds handle it, which is how he's going to handle the Florida recounts, as we'll see. And he's going to be a good guy. He speaks super broken Spanish, but he goes to the clubhouse and talks Spanish with the Dominican players. He got the give and take of charisma way more than Gore ever would.
And he's got a decent Spanish accent, I gotta tell you.
Oh, yeah?
Especially compared to Gore, night and day. I mean, Gore's, at that point, if your Spanish accent is so, like, Peggy Hill.
Me llamo Peggy Hill. Excuse me?
Don't do it. Just speak English. It doesn't look good.
But yeah, Bush is just such a genius at drawing this contrast between himself and Gore on Perv-Piss. Bush is a genius at negating his own weaknesses and maximizing his strength. So everyone knows he's dumb. Everyone knows he's a C student at Yale. So he says, like, what I know is how I feel. Just don't ask me where Kosovo is. He's going to lean into that and own it. And then he's trying to draw this contrast with the fucking dork-ass nerd who is Gore, where Gore is asked by the New Yorker, who are your favorite philosophers? And Gore answers Reinhold Niebuhr and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Never heard of these motherfuckers in my life. And I hate credentialism, but like I do have a PhD in an adjacent field. And I have never heard of these motherfuckers.
You don't know Maury? You don't know good old Maury?
Vous êtes pas le pal.
Ron DeSantis just did something kind of similar when someone asked him who his favorite president was. And I want to say he did a deep cut, and it was just like, you got to do the Trump thing, or the Trump-Bush corollaries are there for sure. When Trump was asked, what's your favorite passage in the Bible? He's like, all of them.
Yeah, well, when they asked Bush who his favorite philosopher was, you know what he said? Very recognizable answer. He said, Christ, because he changed my heart. Boom, fucking crushed it. Don't get me started about fucking Reinhold Niebuhr. Who are you trying to win over with that? Gore so often is just trying to get the answer correct at the expense of trying to win politics.
Listen, the French phenomenology voting block is huge, dude. And you know what? I don't know why, but they all ended up in Miami.
This nerd shit, spoiler alert, will go on to haunt him come the recount.
Definitely.
Let's move on from W. Let's move on to his brother, everybody's favorite Bush.
Jeb!
As our resident Florida correspondent, what are your Jeb thoughts, Isaac?
He has been saved. His legacy, at least in Florida, has largely been saved by how unbelievably terrible the subsequent Republican governors have been. Technically, we've only had Republican governors since then because Charlie Crist, he was a Republican who switched to Dem. But Rick Scott and now Ron DeSantis, it is bad. And so Jeb doesn't even really figure into the Florida imagination anymore. Also, largely because most Floridians today didn't live in Florida when Jeb was governor. So people only know him from his failed presidential campaign at this point.
Which rock, let me be clear.
Oh, delicious. Delicious.
Some true monkey's paw shit. He wished for his older brother to be president, and the monkey's paw exacted the price of him becoming a good little pain piggy on national TV. I'm sorry, he didn't have the safe word.
Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake, all right? Now, you can take it any way you want. It was a mistake. The war in Iraq, we spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives. We don't even have it. George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty. We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East.
But so you...
There were no weapons of mass
destruction. All right. Governor Bush.
While Donald Trump was building a reality TV show, my brother was building a security apparatus to keep us safe, and I'm proud of what he did. And he's had the gall to go after my
World Trade
mother.
Center came down during your brother's reign.
My mother.
Remember that.
Hold on.
Let me finish. My mother.
That's not keeping
Look, I
us
won
safe.
the lottery.
For me, it was so hard for me to hate Trump at first, just because the original clips of him just owning Jeb in the 2016 debates, being like, brutal idea, terrible.
She's literally saying the towers came down while your brother was president.
Yeah, reading all these books, you really get the sense that Jeb is just one of the biggest losers of all time. One of the great quotes from one of the books we read called The Year That Broke America was, as far as I'm concerned, my dad is as close to perfection as any human being can be. Like, he's asked at one point, what are the reason he's in politics? And he said, I want to make my dad proud and keep the family legacy going. Which, like, that sounds great for the rest of the country that your dad is proud of you. What a great thing we can all believe in.
Hey, Jeb, have you ever heard of the concept of a you problem and a me problem? That's kind of a you problem. Your relationship with your father.
He also probably wasn't a great dad himself. His daughter, Noelle Bush, had a big drug problem and actually went to jail.
Really?
Yeah, there's a really funny picture of her mugshot, and the title on the website says, Noelle Bush gets 10 days for crack. It's pretty good. So
crack?
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
She's in Miami, dude. You can get really good blow. What are you doing fucking with crack? That's bizarre.
Yeah. And you can just tell throughout these books that he wakes up in a cold sweat at night thinking about the idea that his brother loses the election because he lost Florida on his watch. He's on Jay Leno saying, I just hope that I can win Florida for my brother. You know, it is something that is at the forefront of his mind. And I think that he very much influenced the results, as we'll see later.
Isn't that a weird thing to say too? Like, you know, in a democracy that your brother is going to win the state for you. I mean, shouldn't that ring alarm bells for people?
Yeah, what you need to understand is that the Bush dynasty is not a family. It is a corporation of some kind. It may even be the corporation, if you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, he's the head of a state in which Republicans dominated state level politics at every level, basically. There had been some Democratic people in the Florida courts due to like a historic historic preference for Democrats, but at this time, governor's mansion, state house, state senate, all of them Republican.
Yeah, which again is like something of an aberration. The Democratic governors ran the state from 70 to 86, and there was a short break, and then from 90 to 98. So this will be important when the recount fight happens. Yes, the state level elected offices dominated by Republicans, but you have liberal-ish courts. And let's be clear, yes, subsequent Florida governors might have sucked, but Jeb also has reprehensible political. First off, it's a big train head. He vetoed high-speed rail in Florida.
Second day in office. Yep.
Yeah, gotta depend on them cars. First governor to pass a stand your ground law, which is pretty exciting. And he tried to kibosh affirmative action, which, happened anyway 30 years later. And God, that's so grim to think about, so bleak. Things truly do not change. And I think very, very significantly for our purposes, under his governorship, massive purges of black people from the voter roll, finding people ineligible, retroactively changing misdemeanors to felony to purge tens of thousands of black people in Jacksonville and other parts of the state from the rolls. Jeb.
All right, let's move on to Al Gore. His most defining feature, he's Al Gore. He's very boring. If you listen to him speak, literally the election is being stolen from him. The thing that probably he's thought about since he was 3 years old, being president. And the most you can listen to Gore for is about 8 words. And then there's like a half-life with your attention. And by the time you're like 30 words in, you're gone. You're thinking about something else. I was just imagining, like, you know how Obama has a podcast with Bruce Springsteen? I was imagining Gore with like a podcast with like Yoko Ono, because that's probably like the only person he could get that would be just as hard to listen to as him. And this is a guy who I think generally like has good ideals for a politician of his stature, right?
Yeah, I think he's incredibly prescient. He was talking about climate change before anyone else was. He saw the importance of the internet, telecommunications, all that shit.
Well, he invented it, so I would think he knows a thing or two about that.
Okay, I want to go on the record and defend Gore and inventing the internet, okay? He didn't say that he invented the internet. The exact quotation that he had was that he, quote, took the initiative. I can't do a Gore.
I took the initiative to...
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, something like that.
In creating the internet during my time as senator from Tennessee, which is kind of true. He sponsored the Gore bill, named after him. I'm quoting The Year That Broke America here, that funded the expansion of a rudimentary communication system originally developed by the Defense Department, hastening its evolution into what was then known as the, quote, information superhighway, while also funding basic research that led to the creation of tools like the first World Wide Web.
Ben, did you just fucking fact check me? Did you just literally fucking fact check me there? Good luck. Okay, this is our last episode together. I'm not doing this again.
I mean, he did invent the internet, practically.
They named algorithm after him, right? So,
the algorithm.
Also, when they were worried about the Y2K bug, you know what politician the White House put on the case? Al motherfucking Gore.
To bore people into submission. Let me tell you about how it actually works. And then they're like, oh, fuck it. I'd rather just die.
He literally saved us from Y2K and he gets no respect. But no, the thing about Gore is that to him, everything is intellectualized. Every single thing. And politics, as Trump showed us, is not a game of the mind. You can't intellectualize something like Elian Gonzalez that we're going to see. You can't treat the recount as like, what an interesting question of jurisprudence.
Yeah. He was very prescient about the environment as well, obviously.
An inconvenient
truth. This is the thing that is the odds-on favorite to end the world, and he was talking about it basically before anyone else. And like, who knows? I mean, if he became president, the world probably would have lasted like another 60 months. So there was a lot at stake here.
That is the most perfect Democratic slogan.
And I think the David Foster Wallace book that we read had one of the greatest digs at Al Gore, which is that he is amazingly lifelike.
So those are our 3 main characters, really 2 plus Jeb. We didn't want to get bogged down. You'll meet some more characters as we go along, but let's start with the primaries, right? We're back in the year 2000. We're jockeying for nominations. And let's start with the most important party of them all, the Reform Party.
Yes, the third party. Go ahead, throw away your vote. Ross Perot had gotten like a significant portion of votes for the first time in forever. And the Reform Party is trying to inherit that legacy. And it's going to be a very, very important party for multiple reasons. Some of them accidental, like the Pat Buchanan fiasco that we'll talk about with the butterfly ballots that helped tip the election. But also because Trump ran in the primary for the first time to be president in this election. And he learned a lot of lessons, I think, about himself and about the American political system.
About the American political id.
Yeah. So, yeah, we get the first aborted Trump presidential campaign. And he hired a campaign staff. He took campaign trips. He published a book called The America That We Deserve. So, we're seeing a slightly different id that he's trying to tap into compared to his 2016 book that he'll write called Crippled America.
That's a borderline slur. I love it.
True. Yeah. The original title was America, actually. There is just so many funny details from Trump running in this election.
And here's the main thing that you need to know about the 2000 Trump Reform Party run. He just spouts platitude, right? There is no build the wall. There is no lock her up. There is no Muslim ban yet. It is just pablum. In the book, his main policies actually include a one-time tax on the rich to eliminate the national debt. It includes socialized healthcare. It includes estate tax reform, because of course it does. But the man is still the man. So we have quotes like, to be blunt, people would vote for me. They just would. Maybe because I'm so good looking. I don't know. Larry King calls me and says, do my show. I get the highest ratings when you're on. He's still the same popularity obsessed narcissist, but he hasn't found his vehicle of xenophobia and nativism yet.
He hasn't found himself yet. No, I mean, it's true. He really hasn't found his shtick yet, because one of the things we'll see in this election, hilariously, is that he's running against Pat Buchanan, who eventually does win the Reform Party nomination. And Pat Buchanan is, how would you describe his politics?
A fucking Nazi, dude.
Yeah. And so Trump is running to the left of Pat Buchanan and trying to primary him. It's such a weird position for Trump to be in, to be like, this guy is racist. He hates the Jews. He doesn't like him. He's not a good guy. He's the voice of reason in this primary. It's crazy because Pat Buchanan, one of his takes is that he's such a non-interventionist for the United States that he doesn't think the United States should have gotten involved in World War II. I'm sorry, the United States shouldn't have fought Germany. We shouldn't have gone to war with Germany. So that's who Trump is running against and lost, by the way.
I gotta add, Jornado, I just pulled this up now. Trump derided Buchanan as, quote, Hitler lover.
He loves Hitler.
He still had the nicknaming juice.
He's our first Jewish president. He took personal offense to this.
Also, I think I definitely have a guy on Instagram named Hitler Lover following me.
Yeah.
But yes, it's always fun to think more about Trump. Just the way he talks. Listen to this quote. There's been a lack of spirit in this country with respect to what's going on. Beautiful. Perfect. No notes. He continues, obviously. Full sentence. Things are starting to look a little bit queasy. People are worried about the 2000 phenomenon, the Y2K. And I don't know that I am, because I don't think that I am particularly, but they think computers are going to come out and gobble and destroy the world. This man is better at words than Barack Obama. This is spectacular. But yeah, this is all an elaborate publicity stunt, because during the 90s, Trump takes some major L's. He gets divorced twice. He has to take some of his casinos public and then shove the debt on the shareholders. He's becoming less and less of a real estate guy and more of just a brand name. And brands thrive on publicity. And he realizes that the easiest way to get publicity is to run for president, even if it's on the fucking crank ticket against Pat Buchanan.
Yeah, and I always understood Ross Perot's campaign to run on this idea of being like anti-New World Order, like what they used to call globalization. Nobody says the words New World Order anytime, but that's kind of what they were talking about.
Some people use them.
Right.
Wasn't that a big part of wrestling at the time too? That's when I thought there was the New World Order wrestling. You guys know?
I'm not a big wrestling.
I'm not either, but they had professional wrestling had this thing called NWO New World Order. And I think that was like a way of just actually distracting you from the real New World Order. So when you typed it up in GeoCities or your Internet Explorer, that's what would come up first.
Right.
Yeah.
To sort of get people to stop looking into it.
Yeah.
Yeah. A sidebar, and I know we're kind of hopping around a little bit. Someone I knew and no longer speak with went off the fucking deep end and became a full-on 4chan Nazi. And let me tell you, the 4chan Nazis are still reading the Pat Buchanan book. He is the intellectual heavyweight of their reading of World War II, how it went down. And it reminds me truly of that great scene in Succession with the Tucker Carlson stand-in, that they need to ask whether or not he's a Nazi.
And what specifically do you find interesting about that period of history? The scale, the tragedy?
Hell yeah.
Yeah, and which tragedies specifically? Europe decimated, 7 million Germans, 20 million Russians, 5 million Poles. Yeah, just checking the till here, Mark, and it seems you're short a few million.
That is the Pat Buchanan thing. World War II was the worst thing to ever happen because of what it did to Europe and the Europeans. And it all got started by Winston Churchill. That's the general thesis. I don't know if Pat Buchanan is still with us, but he's still with us.
Yes, we should probably move on to the other primaries, but I just want to end off by talking about that Trump drops out of the race because him and Melania almost break up. It puts too much strain on the relationship, and he ends the campaign to focus on his marriage, which is very funny, just like Donald Trump in his emo era.
The man's a hopeless romantic, okay?
He's a wife guy.
Yeah. Another guy who was pretty close to winning this as well, but he wanted to finish his term, was Jesse Ventura.
American patriot and hero.
Yeah. This is a guy who won the governorship in 98 on the Retaliate in 98 platform. And just to give you an idea of the politics of the time, one of the things he ran on was that he was going to release the JFK papers. I have the documents. I am going to beat the military-industrial complex.
As governor of Minnesota?
I held out hope for a minute that in 2020 Jesse would throw his hat in the ring. Have you seen that clip of him defending Castro, talking about going there and meeting with Fidel Castro and opening up economic relations between Minnesota and the country of Cuba?
Really? That's awesome.
Incredible, dude. I just looked at him in the eyes. He's like, he did not kill JFK. I can do Gore. I can't do fucking Jesse.
I looked at Castro square in the eyes and I saw his soul for what laid bare.
Yeah, Jesse's the fucking man.
And we know he was against the New World Order because he was in the WWE.
Exactly.
Oh, some wrestling head is going to fucking correct you on that.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh my God.
Fucking nerd.
But yeah, that's how these Reform Party primaries wind down, with Trump dropping out so that he can fix his relationship and be with his woman. But he will eventually lift a lot of Pat Buchanan's actual ideas. The book that we read, The Year That Broke America, is good. Sometimes it can be a little hokey and predictable because it's like, what if I told you there was a candidate who wanted to build a wall and deport all the illegals and it wasn't Donald Trump or whatever. It's this other guy. But I think one of the more fascinating things about this Trump run is that the media landscape was so fundamentally different in 2000 than it would be in 2015-16. So yes, he gets airtime on the three major networks. But at the end of the day, there's no social media for this to become a runaway freight train. And if you're an editor in some media room, you don't actually want to burn up so much of your airtime on the fucking Reform Party candidate on a pre-apprentice Donald Trump run. So there was a ceiling that he inevitably would hit. And I think he just kind of took some very major lessons without being too teleological about it in 2000 that would eventually lead to a successful 2016 run.
Yeah, the lessons he learns are that one, he has to run as one of the two main parties, and two, he has to get as much free media as possible, basically. And he's able to do that much more effectively when social media is around.
Oh, and three, he needs to channel what Pat Buchanan was channeling.
Yes, and that. Okay, moving on to the Democratic primary. So there's literally nothing to say here. To quote Wikipedia, since the advent of the modern presidential primary system began in 1972, Gore remains the only non-incumbent Republican or Democrat to sweep all of the nominating contests in a given year. He had locked it up. There were no challengers.
Yeah, and I think the one thing there is to say is that this is what would have happened in 2016 if it weren't for Bernie. This is what the Democratic Party wants to do, right? And I think it is one of the positive changes post-2016 is that there is no downside for running for president for the Republicans. Actually, shit, man, it occurred to me that, aside from RFK, another American hero, RFK Jr., no one's running against Biden either, eh? Not in the Democratic primary.
Marianne, I think she hasn't dropped out yet.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I think she's still running.
All right. Critical support for Marianne Williamson in the Democratic Democratic primary. No, just kidding. You should vote for Cornel West, whoever you are, wherever you live.
I'm writing in Nader in Florida.
Oh, hell yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the Republican Party primary.
Yeah, so there's a great book that folks should check out called McCain's Promise, which I promise is not a hokey campaign book. It's written by David Foster Wallace, and it's a fascinating little artifact because he did the gonzo journalism thing. He went on the Straight Talk Express, and he covered John McCain for Rolling Stone, and I think it's just an amazing artifact of the time.
Without ever having to actually speak to John McCain, he covered it.
Yeah. It's super Gen X-y. I mean, of course, it's David Foster Wallace. He did kill himself in 2008. I forget when in the year.
September 12th, 2008.
So yeah, I think he didn't see McCain descend to the worst that he would ever be. The W-hugging, the version that we all know. But his book is about cynicism and idealism because the Gen Xers had the lowest voter turnout in all those elections in the 90s, right? They were so disconnected. They didn't give a shit. And one of the weird aspects was John McCain, who always had these retrograde dinosaur fucking views. This is the man who fought MLK Day in Arizona, one of the last holdouts for the federal holiday of Martin Luther King Day. He had young people like showing up to the airport to see McCain as this plucky challenger. And what David Foster Wallace identifies is that he represents a kind of idealism. Even if the policies are shit, we're once again back to this contrast between the man and the policies. Even if his policies are shit, what he brought to the table was he was tortured as a war hero. War hero, right? Whatever. I like guys that don't get captured, as we all know by now. But David Foster Wallace frames it as like, could you imagine a higher cause? Because this motherfucker did. This guy could have left the Hanoi Hilton. Yeah, it's like aimless, nihilistic, cynical Gen Xers is his view of the thing. We're looking for some kind of higher purpose. And we look at this and we can't help but see 2008 Obama, seeing this as the proto version of what we would have years later. But what happens to his run? Most of the party is supporting George W. Bush as a consensus candidate. Bush wins Iowa, but it's close, I think. McCain wins New Hampshire. We move down to South Carolina. Giordano, how does this plucky, rocky upstart story end? What happens to personal friend of the pod, John McCain?
Well, George Bush beats him by just outmaneuvering him politically. George Bush does a great political move, which is to give a speech at a university where there's a ban on interracial dating. His campaign manager identifies it as something that will help him. Yeah, it's founded by a preacher who said that slavery was good for black people because it brought them to America. And this is where Bush spreads the rumor about McCain having a love child.
He's got an adopted Bangladeshi orphan daughter, and they tried to say it was a mixed race bastard child, like he's doing miscegenation. Bush didn't say this, but Karl Rove is rumored to have planted this rumor somewhere, or someone affiliated with the campaign.
The general rule for politicians is don't adopt kids, I think, especially kids of a different race. Have you guys heard about Matt Gates's potential gay lover Cuban adoptee?
Neber? What's his name?
Nestor.
Neber. Nebuchadnezzar is his name.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a great data point for Al Gore, too, to be like, this is who your opponent is. So keep that in mind when you're trying to be a nerd.
Yeah, and McCain's whole thing is that he's going to be honest, right? He's the politician who criticizes his own side, and he'll say the word bullshit or whatever. And it's very funny that in this campaign that is not about ideas or policies, he is undone just by slander about his character, right? This is the neoliberal consensus version of politics. It's tabloids, it's character, it's vibes more than anything else.
After Bush defeats McCain, I have a funny thing to say if you want to. So in a similar fashion of Ted Cruz and that famous face of him endorsing Trump, falling for Trump after Trump said, your wife is fucking ugly.
Yeah.
McCain had to debase himself endorsing Bush after that pretty unforgivable rumor. But his reasoning for endorsing Bush is because of the October 12th USS Cole bombing. He says Bush will do a better job combating terrorism than Al Gore.
Wow.
That's a funny question I like to ask myself sometimes. Like, would 9/11 had happened if Bush didn't do it? And we can talk about that later. But that fact really stuck out to me, that was his reasoning for debasing himself and endorsing Bush.
Wild. Yeah, real blast from the past here. John McCain had had the audacity to call the flying of the Confederate flag offensive. These woke moralists like John McCain. Can we say something about his flying ability so I can drop the jackass riff and
Sure.
He sucks at flying.
One thing that David Foster Wallace said that I think I would have to push back on the man in the bandana a little bit. He said that of all the candidates, John McCain was the coolest because he's a fighter pilot. But I would add that he's crashed most of the planes he's ever flown. Is that cool?
Also, Jesse Ventura was a fucking Green Beret. So shut up, David Foster Wallace, the guy who inspired me to become a writer. Shut the fuck up.
Hopefully he wasn't driving the Straight Talk Express. This is a little move I learned in Saigon. Crashes the bus.
So,
all aboard the Straight Into the Ground Express. Hilarious how often he gets brought up on this podcast.
I mean, he should win some kind of award for having the shittiest daughter. That's some kind of posthumous award, shittiest daughter, John McCain. So the primaries wrap up real early. I think they're done by like February. So let's turn to the campaign. And here's the deal. It's the Nothing Burger campaign. So there's not a whole lot to talk about. Certainly not all that many interesting scandals or whatnot.
Like most M. Night Shyamalan movies, it's mostly known for the ending.
Yes. What's on offer? Each team's pitch is we're offering you more of the same with no big changes. Team W says we're going to restore dignity and honor to the office. This is the election that gives us the famous phrase compassionate conservatism, which is so fucking funny implicitly.
Yes.
Because it's like, we used to be not compassionate, okay? Mea culpa, the way we shredded the social safety net. We weren't compassionate yet, okay?
Weren't they also trying to like diversify the party too? Being like, look, we got a couple black folk here. Look at that.
Oh, yeah. We'll talk about that when we get to the conventions. And again, Bush showing some good political instincts. He actually eschews a lot of the people who worked with his dad and goes for his own guys like Lee Atwater and fucking Karl Rove. He says, I'm not interested in the guys who lost my dad's election. Both of these parties want to run on continuity.
Continuity we can believe in.
Yeah. That's the policy, yes. They both want to run on continuity. Gore and Clinton literally only do one event together.
Yeah, Gore is afraid to use Clinton more. Despite the fact that Clinton is massively popular, even after the Lewinsky scandal, he has great approval ratings. And Gore's daughter, who's about Lewinsky's age, tells him, you need to be an alpha male and scorn Clinton. Like, you're not enough of an alpha male. And this is just not the role that Gore was meant to play. He only does one event with Clinton, like you said. And Clinton is trying to help Gore. He even goes to friends and tells them, go to the press and tell them that he's scorning me. Try to put some pressure on him to incorporate me into the campaign. Clinton also tells Gore that, I don't like your slogan, the people. It reeks of class warfare and failed Democratic politicians of the past.
Dude, this man's a left-wing politician. He's opposed to the people.
It reeks of class warfare.
And, you know, Gore starts rolling out a few policies. He starts talking about slow phase out of the internal combustion engine. He starts going off on his nerd shit. But the big event that's going to define the campaign is the Elian Gonzalez fiasco, which was an ongoing thing. We can't go into the whole beat by beat. I recommend you pick up The Year That Broke America if you want that, because this boy washed up in Florida in 1999 and is eventually deported in April of 2000. Isaac, you look like you're ready to pop off about Elian and the Cubans.
Que pinga. That's all I gotta say. Yeah, I mean, I think that I lived in Cuba briefly, and I'm glad I did, because Cubans in Cuba, amazing. Some of the best people I've ever met in my life. Cubans in Florida, on the other hand, not such a big fan.
Psychopaths, right? Right-wing death squad psychopaths.
I'm actually going to be doing a show about this in the near future, based on a book by an author named Vince Houghton. It's called Covert City, and it's about how the CIA is entirely responsible for the modern city of Miami.
That makes sense.
For decades, the Cuban refugee community was so employed by the CIA that they had more people on payroll in Miami than they did in all of Langley in Virginia. So there is so much insanity, and it's not necessarily the fault of the Cuban people who came as refugees. I think any group of people who come to America become mercenaries, and that's basically what they've been since they've come here. The Cuban refugee community has their hands in not just the 2000 election, but the JFK assassination, basically every right-wing death squad in Central and South America, the drug trade. I mean, it goes on and on and on. That's basically what they've been. And so in 2000, that Elian Gonzalez would be the thing. It's perfect, you know? And so that's my little Cuban Americans in Florida spiel.
Yeah, it's a big part of the story. And I just want to say quickly that too, yeah, like I went to Cuba to see the Rolling Stones, and I was amazed that they still hitchhike and there's no exchanging of money. Like they're just not alienated from each other. But yeah, most people aren't familiar with what happened. So I'll give a quick recap. There's this mother who is trying to get to America from Cuba with her young son, Elian Gonzalez. And there's a storm, and I think they were in a group of like 12 or so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and everybody drowns but Elian. And there's this big question of what to do with him, because his family in America want him to stay, obviously, and their argument is that, hey, his mother died trying to get him here, but his father is back in Cuba saying, I want him back. And legally, that is a stronger claim. And it ends up informing the election a lot because Republicans are very eager to say, no, he's staying, like a fuck Cuba policy.
Which would involve just not applying the immigration law.
Right. Yeah. And Gore is, he's the guy who's like, this is such a fascinating question of jurisprudence.
Is it an immigration law question or a family law question?
Yeah. And Clinton even tells Gore, like, hey, buddy, Florida's in play. You need to focus on this. You need to focus on Elian. And Gore is like, but it doesn't matter. It's just one kid. It doesn't really have repercussions for the country. It's just kind of a weird court case. He's so much of a robot that he doesn't understand that it does matter because morons care about it. And so it will influence the election regardless of any actual practical implications it has for the country.
And he plays it so poorly. I forget the exact details, but he tries to differentiate his own policy from the policy of Clinton. And then eventually the final decision is done by Janet Reno, the AG, the Attorney General. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know why the Attorney General of the United States got involved with this. Maybe because of the immigration angle, I suppose. But the move that they eventually decide to do is wildly unpopular. And for a bit of context, there were nightly vigils outside of Uncle and Aunt's house. And in these nightly vigils, because there were protests wanting to keep the boy there. Sorry, there's vigils in the nighttime, protests in the daytime. Some of these unhinged Cubans have signs saying, Elian is Christ, Reno is Lucifer, Castro is Satan. They're painting murals that might be the album art. I think we need 2 photos for the album art for this episode. One is the Miami mural of magic dolphins saving this boy from the seas and bringing him to America. And the other is of a federal border guard with his gun pointed right in this screaming child's face. Because Janet Reno and the Office of the Attorney General send in the border guards to forcibly deport this child back to Cuba. And the photos are not flattering.
No, yeah, they sent in like a fucking hit team to get the kid from this Cuban family with no weapons. Guys burst into the house with guns.
Which, to be fair, the Cubans did have guns. I mean, Cubans have guns. Another little fun fact about the Cuban community in Miami is that there were over 150 bombings between like 1960 and 1990. Assassinations, bomb.
I've seen Scarface.
Which most people don't get the message of that, you know, what they're actually trying to say about that. But yeah, they would bomb businesses in Miami that showed the slightest bit of sympathy for the Cuban government. They strong-armed this hatred of Castro into Miami, and it is surprisingly still there. So that they would have guns there, I'm like, I get it. It's the Cubans, like whatever.
Well, yeah, the Republicans turned this into huge political hay. It's not like the Cubans were ever voting for Democrats en masse, from what I understand, but this was something that probably would cost Gore the election, though there are many things that cost the election.
Do you have any takes on Janet Reno before we move on? Because she does sound like a pretty remarkable woman, just a very unique person, I guess.
I think she was done a great disservice by an incredible impression by Will Ferrell. Because, yes, when you look at her credentials and what she did, and yeah, she wasn't the best looking attorney general ever, but you have to give her a lot of respect for doing the right thing, really, which was sending that kid back to his father, because that's crazy, right? I mean, like, it's so odd. The child belongs with the father.
Yeah, lifelong bachelorette, Janet Reno. Grew up in the Everglades as well.
Yeah, a real Florida cracker. And we're taking that word back, by the way. Cracker, being a Florida cracker is a good thing.
There's a song about her because she really cracked down on enforcing child support payments. So there's a rap song that's called Janet Reno. First lyric is, in our town we have a state attorney by the name of Janet Reno. She locks brothers up for not paying their child support. In your town you may have someone just like her.
Wow, the scansion there is amazing. But it also should be said that Elian Gonzalez today is a popular lawmaker in Cuba, and quite a handsome guy too. So I don't know if that was meritocratic that he was put in power, or if that had something to do with him being such a international famous figure.
So yeah, we roll through the summer and things are not looking great for Gore. Gore is behind, and then the convention season runs around. Republicans go first, and this is where this is perfect that we have Isaac on this pod. This is where we see the Republicans attempt to roll out their DEI initiatives. 24 years ago, it was actually the right wing who were talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I knew this because in preparation for our Daily Show episode, I watched the Daily Show coverage of the Republican Party in 2000 saying, hey, look, we got some non-whites. So George W. Bush's speech is about inclusion, and we got Colin Powell giving a speech talking about W as the candidate who would, quote, bridge the racial divides. And they parade out Jeb's kid, George, or possibly Jorge P. Bush, who is a half Mexican. They parade him around the convention to show, hey, we're not just for whites anymore, y'all.
In fact, we were in the group chat leading up to this episode, and there's some very funny posters for like Republican convention parties that were hosted in Washington, D.C. And I noticed that they were all like a lot of PACs had gotten into the game, like lobbyists had gotten into the game of hosting parties for conventions and spending like millions of dollars on them. And all the Republican parties, they had hired like doo-wop singers from the 50s to perform at them, because I feel like, for Democrats who want to be like, in the 60s, like I was part of the anti-war movement, I was a hippie. But for the Republicans, like their idea of doing the same thing is like, in the 50s, I listened to Chubby Checker, or like I was, I listened to the Shondells in the 1960s. I was with it. And so that's who's singing at all of their parties.
Yeah. W hires Cheney to do his sweepstakes. You know who Cheney chooses? Chooses motherfucking Cheney. So we got that half of the ticket set. That fucking ghoul. For the Democratic convention, they choose Los Angeles, Hollywood, baby. And there are, fundraising parties and mansions. You got some of our friends like Harvey Weinstein are there.
Harvey Weinstein seemed like he was almost at like every Democratic party of this era in the book. He was definitely one of the big figures.
Yeah. The Clintons are the opening act. They're crushing it. Fucking Barack Obama is such a nobody. He can't get into any good events. The 2000 Democratic convention because he's just a state senator from Illinois.
Let me be clear. I'm on the list.
Look again. Check it again.
Yeah, maybe just check Obama. Maybe they misspelled it wrong.
Hussein, you got Hussein in there?
Maybe it's Hussein Obama.
Yeah.
And the convention could not have gone better for Gore. He does slap Clinton in the face by choosing Lieberman as his running mate, who's this pretty conservative Democrat, the first Jewish person to be on a presidential ballot, but also one of the only One of the only Democrats to vote to censure Clinton over the Lewinsky scandal. Just kind of deliberately trying to distance himself from the very popular incumbent president by choosing this running mate.
Was there any love? Because, like, I know, it is maybe useful in Miami or something to have, like, a Jewish person on the ticket. But do you remember, like, your parents at all being like, well, look at this, a nice Jewish vice president?
No, I don't recall any Jewish affection for him, because the Jew that my family supported was Ralph Nader. Yeah, and we can get into that a little bit later, but that was our mensch right there.
Gotcha. Okay.
But yeah, it couldn't go better for Gore, as I said. We got a big Bill Clinton speech. We got Gore, who was so insistent on both having on stage and talking about Stephen Hawking. He is convinced, like, no, you gotta cut this nerd shit out, man. Nobody wants to see and or hear Stephen Hawking on the TV.
You gotta cut this nerd shit out, Gore. Nobody wants to see that. That's a mess.
You got Jesse Jackson coming out, spitting fire. You got a whole bunch of references to Survivor, which was blowing up this summer, so they're being relevant. Gore plants a big old kiss on his wife. Looks like a real human, kind of. The more I research Gore, the more pathetic I think he is. And the more I think he deserves the most dishonorable samurai death possible. But one of the lines from his speech was, "I stand here tonight as my own man." If you need to say it, you're not. So, yeah, Gore's polling swings up. I don't know. Polls are whatever. They're all over the place. But maybe swings between 16 and 22 points up. This is huge for him, salvaging the campaign, giving him a chance. In the final months leading up to the debates, I don't even know if this is worth saying, because again, it's the nothing burger election, but Bush goes on a metaphor of life tour to showcase his views for America, cradle to grave, for every phase of life. You know where this tour ends, Giordano? Florida. God's waiting room. Someone cleverer than I called it. And then September is just really bad for the Bush campaign. There are these stupid minor scandals that the media tries to blow up, like a hot mic picks up Bush calling a reporter a major league asshole, which is, again, such a quaint scandal 24 years down the line. This was the grab him by the pussy of 2000. Some major league asshole. And then this one was even wilder. A campaign ad had, for 1/30th of a second, an animated text that had the word rats flash across the screen. And the Gore campaign accused the Bush campaign of subliminal messaging.
I remember when that word entered the lexicon, the subliminal.
Yes.
That was the time. I remember my public high school teacher writing it on the board because of that.
There was a Simpsons episode about recruiting for the Navy.
Even at Neoliberal. You gotta love that crazy chorus.
Was it on the screen over Lieberman, or what were they trying to do?
I don't know.
I'll throw in some of the campaign details of how they tried to attack each other. I know that one of the things Al Gore accused Bush of was dyeing his hair. He said, the man dyes his hair. Bush's campaigns, they will try to get Gore on lying about the smallest details. We talked a little bit on our Pat Tillman episode about this figure. He invented that lie of Al Gore inventing the internet. So that's a great example of it. There's also a couple pollution scandals where they'll just try to claim that Gore is exaggerating. Compared to the haymakers that we talked about between Hillary Clinton and Obama in our 2008 election, just very soft stuff.
Yeah. So both sides are prepping for the debates. And there's practice rounds. Bush is getting clobbered. Some campaign aide scrawled a note that just says, "It doesn't matter, we're doomed." Because he's not very bright and he's not very articulate. But what the Bush campaign is so good at doing is that they encourage low standards. They encourage low expectations because they know that they can beat them. They know that they can make Bush seem cogent enough. Whereas Karl Rove is out there saying in his pre-game spin that Gore is the world's preeminent debater. He's the best debater in the world, guys, this fucking nerd.
That's a really interesting strategy.
So they build him up knowing that he's going to fail. And it's generally accepted that Gore loses all 3 of these debates to motherfucking George W. Bush, a man who can't think. A blank slate. That book, The Year That Broke America, calls the week before the debate the high watermark of the entire Gore campaign before he got on national TV and humiliated himself.
Yeah, which is crazy because Gore was considered to be a really good debater up until this point. It was a point of strength. He wrote his Harvard thesis on how important TV debates are. He wrote about that potentially apocryphal story about how people who listened to the radio thought that Nixon won, but people who watched it thought that Kennedy won. So he really got this, and yet Bush made him look like a fucking nerd. Like someone who wasn't very socially competent, we'll say. Bad body language, not cool.
If you watch these clips, Bush looks pretty relaxed, maybe a little hollow, but Gore, and I'm quoting the book again, is hopped up on sugar. I guess he's not a caffeine guy. He's one of these Coca-Cola guys, which embarrassing.
Diet Coke. He drinks a lot of Diet Coke. Yeah.
Embarrassing as a grown man. Drink black coffee or don't
drink
have
pink
caffeine
LaCroix like your favorite podcast host.
Gore spends the entire debate. He's smirking, he's scoffing, he's scribbling. He's gymming the camera, truly. And he just comes off so fucking arrogant. Yes, that's exactly it. That's sighs.
He sighs. That's his way of fact checking him, is to be like,
His cadence was also very funny too, and he just had a condescending air. Obama perfected that kind of rhythm that Al Gore didn't quite hit. His was just a lot more catching your kid doing something bad but not wanting to yell at him. You know, that kind of explaining.
Yes.
Dispassionate, very Protestant. That just doesn't, nobody likes to be talked to like that. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy because he gets to defend the positions that are generally easier to defend. Like one of the things that happens in the first debate is the famous lockbox comments that Daryl Hammond made fun of on SNL. And it comes up because there's this question of what do we do with all this money? We have a surplus. What do we want to do with it? And Al Gore gets to defend the position that, hey, this is a nice thing for the country, so let's give it back to the people in the form of ensuring that Social Security is funded or healthcare is funded. He wants to fund social programs with it as a dividend to Americans, which you think would be pretty easy to defend.
No, it should have been abortions for some and miniature American flags for others.
My plan, Jim, is different. Rather than squander the surplus on a risky tax cut for the wealthy, I would put it in what I call a lockbox.
Governor Bush, your response.
I don't know what that was all about. But I will tell you this. Don't mess with Texas.
Now, Governor Bush.
Jim, could I just add that in my plan, the lockbox would be used only for Social Security and Medicare. It would have 2 different locks.
Governor Bush.
Now, one of the keys to the lockbox would be kept by the president. The other key would be sealed in a small magnetic container and placed under the bumper of the Senate Majority Leader's car.
Governor Bush, the next question is for you.
Let me add something. In my plan, the lockbox would also be camouflaged. Now, to all outward appearances, it would be a leather-bound edition of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. But it wouldn't be. It would be the lockbox. You may think you know the location of the lockbox. And maybe you do. Or maybe that's a decoy or a dummy lockbox. Only the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, myself, and Tipper will know for sure.
And I think the idea of the lockbox was just meant to be a place where future administrations couldn't touch it, right? Couldn't cut it or redistribute it. But he just kept saying the word lockbox. And I don't know how many times he actually said it, but that was the bit in SNL. It's like, this motherfucker can't stop talking about lockboxes.
And it seems like such a good idea too. It's like whenever we talk about Norway, we're like, oh, they're so lucky that they have a lockbox for their natural resource money, right? It just like creates wealth for them, like a sovereign.
Do we say that? Do we call it a lockbox?
No, we don't call it a lockbox, but like that's
that's what I'm saying. The lockbox was the problem.
Yeah, right, true.
The phrase lockbox.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, he screws himself over on what should be an incredibly popular idea.
Also, just truly wild, where they were debating what do we do with all this extra money we have lying around, and not like what should we do about the racialized terrorism our police are meting out on marginalized communities.
Right. Yeah.
Different time.
I also think that the way Will Ferrell discredited the great Floridian Janet Reno, he humanized George Bush with his impression of him. He made him way more entertaining and charming than he even was in real life. More Americans saw Will Ferrell as George Bush than George Bush as George Bush.
Yes. I have this idea that George Bush isn't actually George Bush. George Bush is a performance art piece. Okay, hear me out, Isaac. George Bush is actually a Berlin-based performance artist named Georg Bush. Just spelled the same way with the two umlauts. And they had a pitch that went something like this. So I become president, in a contested election. I start an illegal war. Then I paint pictures of my victims and I display them and I'm rehabilitated and I make the audience question what it means to be an audience. Yada, 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 yada. There's no birth certificate in the Bush family. It's all an elaborate bit. He wants us to rethink our complicity in the art.
So Laura Bush didn't actually kill anybody in a drunk driving accident either? That was...
She actually killed the real George Bush, and this guy Georg offered to step in the place.
Okay, you guys know I'm very susceptible to these kinds of things. So I'm going to furiously research Twitter after this.
In the news recently, by the way, is the fact that, George Bush's paintings will be displayed at Disney World, which I thought was very funny, and that Disney Plus will be making a documentary about his paintings, which fucking woke Disney at it again.
I actually can't disparage Disney anymore because I'm getting a contract with Nat Geo for a story.
We'll cut that out.
I don't care. I haven't signed the contract yet. You said it, not me. If I say anything bad about the mouse, I could get sued. It's pretty crazy.
That was kind of weird. The cast of black guy is George W. Bush for that, though.
People are mad about that.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So that's the first debate. Gore's hopped up on sugar, and they tell him, "Listen, dude, you fucked up. You looked like you were freaking people out with the way you were acting. You looked weird. You were spaz."
Bro, don't say slurs.
There's differences.
Home came to life.
And Clinton told his staff to force him to watch the Lockbox SNL sketch to get a sense for how people were seeing him. And what this does is completely undermine his confidence. Because in the second debate, he is basically sedated. He's like agreeing with George Bush's points as they go back and forth.
He's such a fucking embarrassment of a human being, truly.
He's not that guy. That's like the biggest thing I've learned from this whole thing is like Gore is just not that guy. He doesn't have the dog in him.
No. And here's a crazy blast from the past. There's nothing a Republican hates more than a fact checker, than a debunker. Who debunks the debunkers, who fact checks the fact checkers. In an attempt to get over W's inferior debating skills, the Republicans ran live fact checking on these debates. And they were looking for anything to try and paint Gore as this liar. So he tells a story about like a science class in wherever America that doesn't have enough seats. And they fact check it. It's like, they do have enough seats. We got them in a lie. They're finding this ticky-tacky bullshit and they're live fact checking him. And I'm like, wow. Crazy to see them, like, Republicans doing DEI shit, Republicans doing fact checker shit.
Yeah.
Not that long ago.
Hemisphere, how would you go about as president deciding when it was in the national interest to use U.S. force, generally?
Well, if it's in our vital national interests, whether or not our friends in the Middle East are threatened, that would be a time to seriously consider the use of force. Secondly, whether or not the mission was clear, whether or not it was a clear understanding as to what the mission would be. Thirdly, whether or not we were prepared and trained to win. And finally, whether or not there was an exit strategy. I would take the use of force very seriously. I would be guarded in my approach. I don't think we can be all things to all people in the world. I think we got to be very careful when we commit our troops. The Vice President and I have a disagreement about the use of troops. He believes in nation building. I would be very careful about using our troops as nation builders. I believe the role of the military is to fight and win war and therefore prevent war from happening in the first place. I think that people need to be held responsible for the actions they take in life.
No.
I think that...
Go ahead, excuse me.
Well, I think that's part of the need for a cultural change. We need to say that each of us need to be responsible for what we do, and people in the highest office of the land must be responsible for decisions they make in life.
And then the third debate, Gore finally does win, but at this point, the Republicans are happy that they've taken 2 out of 3. And third debate also notable because it happens after the USS Cole attack. Gore brings up terrorism, but Bush brings up Iraq in this debate.
Dun, dun, dun.
That's foreshadowing. So let's move on to the election itself. November 4th rolls around, and what happens? Well, the election takes place. People all around the country, they go vote. And at 7:45 p.m., CNN calls Florida for Gore. But that gets recanted shortly after.
What the networks give us, the networks take us away. NBC News is now taking Florida out of Vice President Gore's column and putting it back in the too close to call column.
25 very big electoral votes are hanging in the balance. This no longer is a victory for Vice President Gore. We're moving it back.
And then Bush's relative helps him win the election. And it's actually not Jeb. It is his cousin, Ellis, who is working at Fox News and is in charge of forecasting the election for some reason at one of our major news networks. And he decides to call the election for Bush at Fox, who's the first network to do so. And like within 4 minutes, I believe, all the other networks also call it for Bush. And so we have this situation where like his cousin begins the media process of crowning Bush the president.
Yeah, let's pause for a second here. I didn't say what we read in preparation for this episode at the top of the episode, but we read either all or parts of 4 books. We read McCain's Promise by David Foster Wallace. We read Too Close to Call by Jeffrey Jack in the Tubin. We read The Year That Broke America by Andrew Rice. And then I paged through a little bit of a book called How to Steal an Election by David W. Moore, who's a pollster.
Why'd you guys tell me to read Mein Kampf?
We just think you should read it.
Okay.
Listen, you got to hear both sides, Isaac. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
We did a fact check on Mein Kampf.
Pants on fire is what I give it. But the point that I wanted to make is that David W. Moore, who wrote How to Steal an Election, he's a real pollster guy, right? And anyone with half of a fucking brain can tell that the other networks had to call it after Fox did because it's a race to the bottom for ratings. If one network's called it and no one else has, everyone's going to flip over to the channel who's got the best, freshest, dankest news.
We've all seen The Newsroom.
Yeah. But the other networks have never said that. They all will just do a bald-faced lie and say like, oh, no. Our internal polling just aligned with what Fox had. But it's like, this motherfucker, this former editor at the Gallup poll says it's not truly grounded in the data science. And this matters because for the fight that's about to come, if everyone has this preconceived notion that Bush did win, thanks to the media, then Gore's going to come off like the sore loser, like the one who's attempting to steal the election or whatever. What they should have said is that we don't know who won, or better yet, it's a tie. But this is the first blow against the Gore campaign, is the media calling it. Even though it has no actual legal force, the fact that they call it is going to be huge in the political fight that he fights in the next 36 days.
So Gore then sets up a concession, and this creates a very funny scenario where Gore is on the way in a motorcade to do his concession speech, and his team, who is calling on very rudimentary cell phones of the year 2000, are trying to get someone who's like large enough to push through the crowd to tell Gore, don't go on stage and concede. but they're able to tell Gore, like, hey, you polled as negative 15,000 votes in one county, so there's some voting irregularities that are going on, and you may not want to concede just yet.
Man, I could see Gore somehow putting up negative 15,000 numbers. The man is like the negative vacuum space of a personality. It makes sense he could somehow find a way to get negative votes.
At this point, he's already conceded privately to George Bush, but he has to now call George Bush back and recant his concession, which results in one of the funniest conversations I've ever read about. Basically, he calls Bush and is like, I need to take away my concession. And George Bush responds, well, in Texas, your word means something, but I guess it doesn't for you. And it's just like, how old are you, man? As if you're just going to give up the presidency because your word means something.
Yeah, and in all of the books that we read, they all describe some moment. It's either the first one or the second one, I forget now. But Gore, when he's watching the elections, is lying on his stomach with his head propped up in his hands like a teenage girl writing in a diary. I'm sorry, I hate this man. I hate the way he lies down. He doesn't lie down good enough.
So Bush says to him, my brother says that Florida is going for me. And Gore responds, well, your brother doesn't get to decide who wins the election, and there's no reason to get snippy about it.
So we got a contested election, right? It's been called for Gore, it's been called for Bush. The dust is settling. And I really recommend the Too Close to Call book if you're interested in these 36 days, done by Jeffrey Jack and the Tubin. The man may jack it on Zoom calls, but he's a pretty good writer. And it is like an episode of Veep or The Death of Stalin, seeing these bumbling fucking lanyard dorks try to execute power, where none of them even know how a recount works. They have to call in a guy like fucking Harvey Keitel in Pulp Fiction. It's like, these are the best damn recount lawyers we got.
Yes.
They literally wrote the book on recount law, but they didn't make too many copies. We can't have the other side knowing it. And all these people whose job it is to win elections are learning about what a recount is and how it works. They're learning in real time what a Chad is. It's just extremely funny to see them bumbling.
But to be fair, what the fuck is a I mean, like, when you look at the actual voting
Brother,
machine,
I see a Chad every day when I look in the mirror.
I see a pregnant Chad right now. I actually almost bought an old machine off Craigslist, like one of the machines in Dade County that fucked up. But I don't know where the fuck I would put that thing. Just like, hey, look at this thing that destroyed the world. This like dumb fucking machine. But the recount laws in Florida themselves, were very obscure and weird. I guess it goes state by state. The other funny thing is that different counties had different types of machines.
Yes,
so it's not
correct.
uniform. It is so laughable that we call this country a fucking democracy. Because you see this and you're like, the Soviets were on to something, right? I mean, like, maybe no voting at all is better than this, whatever this is.
Yeah, so I guess we should back up and give a little bit of the context. The official tally puts Bush ahead by 500 and change. At a certain point, it stabilizes around that number. And there's some fluctuation, right? And there are so many problems with the election. Over 6 million people voted. The margin is 500 votes. So it means that mistakes anywhere can have this massive outsized voting.
It's like 0.1%. Yeah, so there's a mandatory recount, which is called, first of all, because if it's less than 0.5%, Florida has a mandatory recount law. So they do that. But that really doesn't change the vote count that much, because that basically just means running the papers through the machine again. And it changes it. It brings his lead down slightly by like 100 votes, but not enough to actually change the outcome. And so they have to do a hand recount is what they discover. And this is where you actually look at all the votes by a human, not just running it through the machine again, and you determine the intent of the vote.
Machines can sometimes misread or fail to detect the way ballots are cast. And when there are serious doubts, checking the machine count with a careful hand count is accepted far and wide as the best way to know the true intentions of the voters.
And the intent is very difficult to figure out, but there's a couple rules of thumb that they follow. In general, there's two types of ballots, okay? There's Bubbles and there's Chads. And every time Bubbles want to have a good time, the Chads fuck it up. The Bubbles are like the SAT bubbles that you would fill in with a pencil. And The issue here is frequently overvotes, so people fill in multiple bubbles. You know, when you get to 1% of people, you start getting into people who just fill in multiple bubbles because they don't understand how a Scantron works, because of course they fucking don't.
Yeah, they're old. It's Florida. It's like filled with old people. And the people who designed some of these ballots literally put it in the smallest possible font permitted by election law.
Yeah, and so the most frequent issue with these bubbles is overvoting, where you fill in Al Gore and then you fill in the blank one and then you write Al Gore. And the other type of ballot that gives people problems, which is honestly a bigger issue, is the Chads. 1 in 200 of the bubble votes are thrown out for overvoting or undervoting. 1 in 25 of the Chad type ballots are thrown out.
Damn.
And so Chads are a voting mechanism in which you punch a hole through a piece of paper and then a Scantron fires a laser through the hole to determine which one you voted for. The issue is that a lot of people don't really punch through the hole fully. And so that's what a pregnant Chad is. Imagine I half punched the hole out. So you get a bunch of these very weird cases where it's like the pregnant Chad, the garage door Chad, where you just got the bottom, or the corner Chad where you just dented a corner. And so I can establish intent, but the machine can't technically read it as a yes, right? And so obviously the biggest issue with the Chad type votes is undervoting.
The biggest issue with the Chads is that they get all the girls, dude. I've been on the forum.
Yeah, the virgin overvote versus the Chad undervote. And so this is kind of the only lane that Al Gore really has realistically to pursue, is doing a hand recount of these undervotes and overvotes. A tremendous amount of votes are thrown out in this election. And we'll talk about this more later, because you have to determine the intent by a human. You have to look at this and say, oh, this person wrote Al Gore twice. Clearly the intent was to vote for Gore, even though this was thrown out. Or, oh, this person half punched the hole in, but it didn't actually register. And so clearly the intent was to vote for Gore, but they couldn't get the punch through the entire hole because
of their old brittle bones.
Yeah, or the garbage bin underneath was full of past holes and they couldn't punch it through all the way. And so this is the best thing that you can do if you're Gore. But what does Gore do instead?
To be clear, the best thing you could do is to try to get a hand recount with parameters that are as broad as possible. That would be the best possible strategy.
Yes, because as our election experts will tell you, if you are behind, you want to recount as many votes as possible. Whereas George Bush's strategy is, if you are ahead, you want things to stay the same. You want to recount as few votes as possible. And so Gore starts this campaign to count every vote.
Who could hate that? Who could be opposed to that? Count every vote.
Yeah, Bush tells his aides, he's like, I need a PR strategy. How could I be against count every vote? But they quickly find one because Gore shoots himself in the foot by saying, well, just so you don't think I'm overreaching, how about we just count votes in 3 counties and only the undervotes? How about that? And it's like, dude, you've just given the Republicans a beautiful messaging PR thing to be like, well, how come he only wants to look at 3 counties?
Oh, and which 3 counties did he choose? Are they the 3 most Democratic leading counties in all of Florida?
And so he just gives the Republicans this beautiful ideological opening, because the Republicans kind of have an issue ideologically with trying to get the federal government to step in to stop a state's right to make decisions about how the election should be run.
Yes, that's the legal background. Is that in the Constitution, states run their own elections. And as Isaac said, in Florida, each individual county ran their own fucking elections. So if Gore wanted to, he could have demanded a recount in all 67 counties. Complicating matters further, there was a law on the books in Florida that said that the election had to be certified by the Secretary of State by an arbitrary date. Scratch that. It didn't say that it had to. And one place it said that it must, in another it said that it may, or it was shall versus may. So there was a contradiction on the actual books. This, I don't even want to say it's a banana republic. It gives banana republics a bad name. Gore's strategy is, we are a nation of laws, count every vote, let's get it right. Gore, the nerd that he is, he's like, there's a fundamental truth inside of these ballot boxes that we can get to using our brains, and we can find the fundamental truth. So he had the view that the election was over. That was his grand strategy. The Bush campaign was like, oh, fuck that. We play to the whistle. we We're going to kick you in the teeth until the fucking whistle goes. So their goal is no matter what, no matter how, stop the votes. And their strategies are going to be lean on Katherine Harris, the Secretary of State, who is a registered Republican.
Not only is she a registered Republican, but she was the co-chair of the Florida campaign for George Bush. So,
yep.
And she's also kind of my neighbor. She lives right down the road from me.
You ever see her around?
No, she's a recluse now. We'll get into Katherine Harris in a minute, but
before she was a beauty queen, and she got into politics by being a hobnobber of sorts.
Sounds like a slur, dude.
Another famous Florida cracker. She was a citrus heiress. The husband of her family owned immense amounts of property in the state of Florida that were just empty citrus groves for a long time. So she's money. She's got money.
Yeah, she got into politics because she started fighting with some local politician, right?
Yeah, she was like a socialite. She married a fucking Danish art collector or something.
Well, that was her second husband. But interestingly enough, she interned for one of our greatest governors, Governor Childs, who was a Democrat and did a lot of good things for the state. Last great governor the state of Florida ever had.
So if you're the Republicans, right, what do you want to do? Well, you know that you're up right now, so you want to preserve that, and there's a deadline, quote unquote, arbitrary deadline that doesn't actually matter, but for whatever reason, the country is deciding to actually stick with it. So what do you want to do? You want to stall, right? So you want to stall any attempt at a recount, whether or not it's legal. Just add days to every single process. If someone is doing a hand recount, just argue over intent for every single vote, and all you need to do is stall until the deadline. And so that's where they reach out to Katherine Harris for, because she is in charge of the state in some capacity. She's the state secretary.
Well, let me add a little bit about Katherine Harris here. Katherine Harris was also responsible for picking the vendors who both operate the machines, but also she helped purge over 170,000 voters from the Florida database. She hired a company, Boca Raton-based company called Database Technologies, whose parent company was called Choice Point, and they're out in Texas. So, it is very funny, again, that you have private companies that provide the technology to vote. And there's just a bunch of different vendors bidding at different counties. Should be one fucking machine throughout the entire country. I mean, that's so obvious. Now, we learned that many of these purged voters were wrong. It was a quote unquote programming error.
Yeah.
And everybody knew that this company had problems even before she gave them the contract in 1999, but she gave it to them anyway. Now, the fact that it originated out of Texas should be like, who were they friends with? What's going on here? But anyway, so besides purging 170,000 voters in the state of Florida, at least 8,000 in these particular counties were found to have been inaccurately purged because either someone shared the name as someone else or the program inaccurately saw someone who was convicted of a misdemeanor and replaced it with a felony. And in Florida, felons can't vote. Right. So the shenanigans started a long time ago. And you either have to give them a lot of conspiratorial credit for predicting that this was going to be the way that they win the election, but it's really I think the death of democracy by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
These little things clearly do add up in the state of Florida. And interestingly enough, to skip a little bit ahead in time, Katherine Harris was bad in front of the camera. She was this awkward, aging beauty queen. The Bush administration would eventually throw her under the fucking bus. Even though she was the figure who killed democracy in a lot of people's minds, it's easier to blame a woman, I guess. They did not give her any position in the Bush administration. She would continue to run for office in the state of Florida and be utterly embarrassed. She was just beset with scandals, people just going to fucking prison around her constantly. And the Bush administration itself said, yeah, we don't really like her. She wanted to run for Senate and actually we're going to Mel Martinez. How about this guy? Because we don't like Catherine. And she sold her fucking soul to the Bush administration and they fucking kicked her ass. So that's the story of Katherine Harris. Now she is a recluse, doesn't talk to anybody. She attends a Pentecostal black church in town, which is kind of weird. But yeah, for the most part, I hear she's a nice lady. That'll be the end of my Katherine Harris spiel.
Sunset Boulevard in Saratoga, Florida.
If you want her address, one of your craziest listeners wants her address, just DM me.
Yeah, so she sells her soul, and what she does for George Bush essentially is deny attempts to recount the votes. So they know that they need to recount the votes. They try to, and she says no, because she's the Secretary of State. She ultimately holds power. And they go to the Supreme Court of Florida, who says, no, you have to allow this recount, obviously, and it reverses her decision, but it doesn't matter because she just managed to kill a few days. And so that's kind of the way that she's able to do George Bush's bidding, is like, she's going to get overturned, but she can at least add a few days to every one of these processes. And this is also where we get the famous Brooks Brothers riot, which was instigated by Roger Stone. He got a bunch of Republican campaign staffers to show up to a vote recount and cause mass chaos by protesting outside. We played a clip of that in our George Bush episode.
Stop the count, stop the fraud, 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 stop the count, stop the fraud.
And yeah, the name of the game here is basically just to stall, to filibuster, because for whatever reason, we have an arbitrary date that the Electoral College has to be submitted. So we're going to stick to that.
Ignoring votes means ignoring democracy itself. And if we ignore the votes of thousands in Florida in this election, how can you, or any American, have confidence that your vote will not be ignored in a future election? That is all we have asked since Election Day, a complete count of all the votes cast in Florida. Not recount after recount, as some have charged, but a single full and accurate count. We haven't had that yet. Great efforts have been made to prevent the counting of these votes. Lawsuit after lawsuit has been filed to delay the count and to stop the counting for many precious days between Election Day and the deadline for having the count finished. And this would be over long since, except for those efforts to block the process at every turn.
Yeah, and each of these recount efforts is led by a former Secretary of State. Warren Christopher for the Gore campaign, and James Baker for the Republicans, who is this absolute fucking killer that gets sent down there.
James Baker III, who, if you want to talk about a fucking spook, James Baker III is your guy.
But yeah, James Baker is the first guy to say this disputed election will end up at the Supreme Court. And his primary goal, as well as stalling, right? Stalling is the first thing to do to try and make sure that Gore doesn't pull into the lead with the hand recounts. But his other goal is get this question in front of the Supreme Court so that they can be the final authority and put the kibosh on it. Which again, like we've talked about this before on the pod, either in a glancing or direct way. Republicans don't really care about hypocrisy. They care about winning. They care about executing their project. So yes, they will shout and cry and weep about judicial overreach or federal overreach or activist courts. But if they can use any of those things to advance their agenda and achieve power, they fucking will. Because it's politics. It's about power. Who gives a shit about hypocrisy?
Yeah, I'd like to add another funny thing about James Baker III. You mentioned earlier that Junior kind of eschewed some of Poppy's friends. Well, James Baker is super tight with George H.W. Bush. He's still alive, and they will both meet each other in hell very soon. James Baker III served under Reagan and Bush and has insane CIA connections. He was also a senior advisor to the Carlyle Group. And for those of you who don't know the Carlyle Group, you're not a conspiracy head, and I'm sorry about that. But they basically are the architects of 9/11. The Carlyle Group on September 11th was meeting with the brother of Osama bin Laden at a Ritz-Carlton hotel.
Well, to be fair, he has a lot of brothers.
It's really unbelievable that, I don't know how, I'm going to start going off on some crazy tangents here, but that James Baker, why the Republicans are fucked today is because they don't have James Baker when Trump tried to do his own little recount game or whatever. He had fucking Giuliani. You know? James Baker is the last of a dying breed. one of the most evil men in American history. He helped draft the shock doctrine after the fall of the Soviet Union, you know, the thing that killed millions of people.
Yeah.
As they privatized Russia. So, yeah, real proper demon hours during the recount. Another character who was at the recount and fussed around at the Supreme Court was Texas Senator Ted Cruz. He was part of the legal council that helped sway the Supreme Court in one direction or another, but that turned out to be incredibly apocryphal. When he wrote about it in his book, it's called Ted Cruz, I don't suck that much, or whatever it was called. People asked other members, including James Baker, like, did Ted Cruz actually do all this? And they're like, fuck no, dude. Guy was annoying, didn't do anything. The Bush administration wanted nothing to do with Ted Cruz, so they didn't bring him on whatsoever. Okay, end transmission.
No, that's all good shit. I underappreciated James Baker's connections to intelligence when I was reading the extremely normie Tubin book, but normie lib Tubin book.
Yeah, no, James Baker, scary motherfucker.
But yeah, the Republicans have a much better plan than the Gore campaign does. And there is, in this first period, a whole bunch of back and forth where, yeah, the state Supreme Court extends the deadline. There's a federal court in Miami that sides with the Gore campaign. Most of the court decisions are going Gore's way, but the Republicans are still chewing up clock on the recounts.
And Gore also, he chews up a bit of the clock. Like, one of the first voting irregularities that comes to the public consciousness and things that Gore seizes on, which eventually becomes a nothing burger. Like, there's nothing you can do about it. But the butterfly ballot is one of the worst parts of the election, just from a democracy perspective. If you've ever seen a picture, it's just one of the most confusing user interfaces for a ballot of all time. And it resulted in a heavily Jewish county voting for a Nazi more than any other county in the state.
We are self-loathing, though, to be fair. We're incredibly self-loathing people, so...
Yeah, and it's because of, you know, the way that the bubbles are set up, essentially. It looks like if you're voting for Gore, you're actually voting for Pat Buchanan. And so Pat Buchanan even said, there's no way that those people intended to vote for me.
That was so funny. Even Pat Buchanan's like, no, they didn't vote for me. That would be
those
crazy.
Dang Jews didn't vote for me. And Gore seizes on this, and he's like, look, something's wrong. But there's ultimately nothing to be done about the butterfly ballot. What are you going to do? Like, you can't reapportion those votes based on
the popular vote, the rest of it. That's something they entertain. They're like, oh, here are 3 things we could do about the butterfly ballot. We could rerun the election in that county over entirely. We could do hearings and have people say, I accidentally voted for Buchanan, let them go again. Or we could nuke his votes and redistribute them along the popular vote. Or it's like, yeah, none of these have any legal precedent and are not going to happen.
Yeah. So it ends up being a nothing, right? Unless you can have them revote, you can't just reapportion votes. There's no legal basis for doing that. And so they do also waste time on this butterfly ballot. And it's just a situation where, like, yeah, it proves that UI of a vote can have tremendous impact on the outcome. Like, just how it's like, oh, if we change this font, 5% of users will do this other thing. Like, that's also true at the ballot box.
Especially in a county full of old people.
Yeah.
Right? Like...
Just to reiterate this point that Gore wants to find, you know, the truth in the ballot. I want to know who really won. And he's losing because of this obsession with not fighting this as a political issue, but rather a fact-finding issue.
Yeah, and I believe Jesse Jackson encouraged Gore to do what Roger Stone had got his goons to do, which was be present on the street, get out there and say, like, you're fighting for democracy here. But yeah, Gore, the good fucking liberal that he is, was like, violence is bad.
Yeah, and he believes in democracy. Like, he's an end of history guy. He's like, the system works and we'll end up with the true outcome. And it's like, dude, your opponent beat McCain by spreading a rumor that he had a love child that was his adopted daughter. Like, what are you talking about? That's not how this, it's not a fucking Panglossian vision of the world. And so Al Gore, at one point, when it gets decided that the election is going to go to the Supreme Court, he calls his dad to say, Dad, thank God it's going to the Supreme Court. The magic judges are going to decide the true outcome that, you know, has been ordained by the system, and not a partisan court that's going to rule 5-4 on party lines.
And this is where DEI we got to get rid of it because a black Supreme Court justice and the first female Supreme Court justice both voted for Bush. So what the fuck are they complaining about, right? I mean, like DEI has helped the Republican Party more than they even care to acknowledge.
And the first Italian as well. Yeah. You know, we got to keep them off the court, I think.
Yeah, no more Catholics on the Supreme Court is what I would say.
It's basically the highest office they can hold.
Tell that to Joe Brandon.
Yeah, and traditionally when the court has offered guidance on election outcomes, they've done so unanimously in order to preserve the dignity of democratic elections. Well, not anymore. This is going to be a 5-4 split. They basically shut down the recount and they go, nope, Bush wins. And Scalia in his decision says it wouldn't be fair to Bush to do a recount because there's a chance that he did win. And if he did, a recount would cast a cloud of doubt over his mandate and his legitimacy. Unlike the legitimacy of having the election handed to him by his brother and his cousin.
And judges appointed by his father.
Yeah, exactly. Stephen, is it Sotomayor? Or who is the dissenting writer in this case? Stephen something.
I thought Stevens was the last name.
Oh, yeah, you're right. It is Judge Stevens.
Joe Brown.
Judge Joe Brown in his dissenting opinion said, I used to be on the streets and now I'm not. He said, we may never know the winner of this year's presidential election, but we do know the loser is the nation's confidence in the electoral system and the court's ability to be nonpartisan.
That's big agree to disagree energy.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. And yet, this is the decision that was famously cannot be used as precedent for any other decision. This is the decision where, like, no one recused themselves.
That is one of the most hilarious, shameless things of all time to be like, oh, yeah, and you can't use this as precedents. Yeah, this is a one-time only thing.
And we didn't say this explicitly, but the challenge that the Republicans brought to the selective recount was one grounded in the fucking Reconstruction Amendment. By counting those 3 counties only by hand, you were, in effect, suppressing the vote of the other 64 counties. So in order to protect voting and democracy, we need to stop counting these votes.
Yeah, that's the legal jurisprudence that they used. It was called the safe harbor provision, which basically says that everybody should have the same ability to vote. And by only recounting certain counties, you could be affecting a protected class by only doing that, which is just so ironic that this is the reason the Supreme Court gets to stop the revote. Because this is an election where in Florida, which we'll talk about in a moment, 1 in 7 black people had their vote thrown out compared to 1 in 50 white people. We can't do a recount because we need a fair election. But this is the actual election that we're talking about, one in which 1 in 7 black people had their votes thrown out. So just a hilarious standard that they've decided suddenly matters. Once again, Gore shooting himself in the foot because Gore has every right to ask for a recount in every single county. And the reason he didn't do it was because he thought he would basically be asking too much. He wanted to be a good boy and be like, well, I only need 3. I only need 3 of the 64. I hope that's okay. Like just the lowest T beta energy of all time to be like, I'm actually doing like, I'm being nice. I'm being nice and only asking for 3. So I hope you appreciate
just the tip. Just the tip.
Just the tip. We only would like to count the tip of Florida in Miami-Dade County.
There we go. Just the tip wouldn't be a bad title for the episode either. Yeah. And it gets across in Toobin's book. He is obsessed with politicians in Washington and the national media. He needs to be liked and respected and not seen as a sore loser. Toobin makes it sound like Gore took a rather hands-on policy, especially in contrast with Bush. Bush was in Crawford, Texas. He gave the keys to fucking James Baker III, said, fix this for me. He did a few little, like, keep the morale of the troops up appearances or calls or film things, but he is a silver spoon daddy's boy who's like, oh, my uncle and cousin and dad's work friends will solve this for me. And they did.
Yeah, even after the Supreme Court, apparently Gore's team did approach him and say, there's still a legal path for you to fight for this. And Gore said, no, this is America. We're done. which is just one of the most bleak sentences of the campaign.
And you had Jesse Jackson saying, like, we can get out in the streets and protest. And Gore runs Jesse Jackson out of Florida.
Yep.
He didn't want to be seen to be playing the race card.
This is where I just have nothing but respect for my Jan Sixers, because as stupid as they may have been, do something.
Be the change you want to see in the world.
They're big Gandhi fans. The Jan Sixers.
Yeah, no, the fact that there was such minimal outrage, watching an election get stolen in front of your face. Maybe that's why, like, I think millennials are as cynical about politics as we are, because we saw this happen. So it's like, so this is all fake, right? This isn't real.
The Supreme Court could just decide that we're going to stop counting.
Yeah, there were some protests at the inauguration in 2001. And I think there was a sense that there was some kind of stain on this election and this presidency until 9/11 happened. And then, you know, water under the bridge.
So just before we get to our themes, I just wanted to talk a little bit about who won. That's the big question. Despite all this, who won? And we actually do know, because the newspapers, the good folks in the newsroom, and a few years later, they got access to the ballots and they were able to do a recount of intent based on what was on the ballot. The thing that should have happened. If you remember, the margin is 537 votes for Bush. And they found that if you just count the undervotes, which was Gore's strategy, Bush would have still won by a couple hundred votes. However, if you counted the undervotes and the overvotes, which Gore didn't ask for because he thought it would be asking for too much and I don't want to trouble you, then Gore would have won. He would have won by a few hundred votes. Had he asked to recount the overvotes and the undervotes, he would have won by 130 votes, which is such an insanely small margin. But he never asked to recount the overvotes, and he was never able to recount really any votes. I think they were able to recount one county in time by the deadline, the smallest one, but they weren't able to get Miami.
Volusia. There was four counties, three in the Miami area. There's the one up by like Daytona, Volusia County.
Yeah, Volusia finished up their recount. That was the one, yeah.
So Gore would have won by 130 votes. Had he had the optimal strategy and been allowed to implement it, he would have won by 130, which are two big ifs. But I think all of that is kind of a moot point, because the first theme that we'll talk about, which is black voter suppression that happened in this election. To give you an idea of how important this was, we're talking about 130 vote margin, remember. If black people had had their votes thrown out at the same rate as white people, they would have added an additional 50,000 votes. Just multiple orders of magnitude.
Hold on, Giordano. Are you sure Gore can find 130 votes there?
They were all big Pat Buchanan heads.
They all would have gone for Nader. 50,000 more Nader voters.
Yeah, Nader with a hard R. So we're talking about 50,000 versus 130. I mean, the scale is not even comparable at all. And I want to open this discussion by just talking about, this is how, like, racism manifests itself in America. How does it actually affect votes, you might ask? And there are many situations where it can, and I'll give you a couple examples. You know, we mentioned overvotes being thrown out a lot, right? If you overvoted, you voted twice, like you happened to circle the Al Gore bubble and then you wrote his name in. So if you were in a white county, you had a newer voting machine, which when you submitted this ballot would have told you, hey, you voted twice, please fix it. If you were in a majority black county, you were given no warning because you had an older voting machine. It would have just accepted your vote and then discarded later as being an overvote. So this is the manifestation of how, like, racism can disenfranchise you by giving you a fucking voting machine that doesn't work, right? Yeah, and so in Palm Beach County, for example, it resulted in 25% of votes being discarded as unreadable. Yeah, and then again, Isaac, you brought up this situation with Catherine Harris where they had purged the voting records of people, like, with misdemeanors incorrectly. And so 1 in 5 black men couldn't vote, including a man who had been convicted of vagrancy in 1959, like just being overzealous with purging people from the voting records based on having the same name as someone, based on having a misdemeanor.
Yeah, it's a clerical error that puts misdemeanors as felonies. And yeah, a vagrancy charge in 1959 has taken away your right to vote. Insane.
There's a bunch of other edge cases too. Jacksonville had this situation where they had 2 pages of candidates And just because of, again, like the way that the UI was set up, it caused 27,000 people to vote twice by accident by just having a confusing layout in that specific county. Again, we get back to this Banana Republic thing of just like, how do we have 64 different systems for how the UI looks? Like, it doesn't make any sense. And Gore says he doesn't want to play the race card in an election where it comes down to one state with a 130 vote margin in an election where 1 in 7 black people had their vote thrown out. What a fucking moron.
Who played the race card first?
Yeah.
Was it the people who disenfranchised the black people? Or was it the people who talked about disenfranchising the black people?
Yeah.
I guess, much like Bush v. Gore, we'll never know who truly played the race card.
Yeah. He asked Jesse Jackson to leave Florida and says to a business magazine, "It's time to end all talk of disenfranchisement of black voters in Florida. It's time to stop accusing Republicans of racism."
Why?
Jesus Christ.
I'm not going to keep this on the pod because I'm a coward. This man should... It would be moral for him to...
Yeah. Ginsburg originally had drafted a dissent mentioning this racial disparity in the way that votes were thrown out, but Scalia had convinced her as a personal friend to, quote, tone down the Al Sharpton tactics. Why is anyone listening to Scalia unless it's advice on, like, how to eat a pie or something?
Have you seen those pictures of RBG and Scalia on an elephant together in India?
Oh, no.
They're riding an elephant going like, "Ew, woo."
Jesus. There's a statue of her here, like where I live across the street at the DeKalb Market.
Well, I know where I will piss when I'm drunk at night.
Yeah. And so, yeah, 1 in 7 black people have their vote discarded compared to 1 in 50 white people. So
awful.
But math, come on, guys. That's nerd shit. What are you guys doing giving me numbers for?
Just a reminder, this is an election in which the Supreme Court stops the recount on a discrimination basis because we can't equally recount in every county. It could affect a protected class. It's already affected a protected class.
It's also funny, too, that I know this is like typical lib shit after 2016, but Al Gore significantly won the popular vote. So it's funny we'd even argue about this fucking country. I swear to God.
Yeah, what a fucking country where you can win by a margin of 500,000 votes in the popular vote. But because this one state had a 130 vote margin, or sorry, a 357 vote margin, it's a moot point.
Fucking Calvin Ball ass democracy we're running here.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
It's so depressing. It's funny. It's really funny, but we are so fucked here. It's like, and this is, I mean, if we get into this in the echoes in history, but this is a real proper hinge point in history, I think.
Yeah. And no one realized it at the time. Everyone thought it was the fucking coin flip election. No one realized, oh, which fucking mashed potatoes ass cracker do I want running the country? Running my $5 trillion surplus that's coming. I also would add one more thing. Some of the worst ghouls for the architects of the war on terror. I'm thinking in particular about the warmongering walrus himself, Bolton. Bolton was an active participant in stopping the recounts. He's one of the guys who's running into the recount center with the fucking letter of marque in his hand saying, "Stop the recount, I have it," or whatever. And he's rewarded for his service in this judicial fucking coup with a job in this administration. Like I said, Georg Bush is he's dedicated to his craft of performance art, but he's a blank slate. He was always going to be surrounded by Cheney and Poppy and whoever. I don't think there's a world where he somehow becomes the non-interventionist that he pretended to be, but this controversy in Florida ensured that just the worst grima worm tongues of his father's orbit were very close to him.
Yeah, it really sucks to be Catherine Harris because she appears to be the only person who wasn't given like a cushy job for thwarting democracy.
Yeah. Misogyny, dude. Misogyny.
Yeah.
Hey, I have a couple other themes I wouldn't mind talking about. One is this idea of the millennium, right? I think that's a very interesting idea, and I think that it was something that it was the forefront of people's minds at this time. I remember it's like, we as a human race are entering the third millennium, and this is a special moment that we get to experience the clock go to zero for 3 digits, right? It was very much a big deal. And it's also an era where we're entering the digital era. And so it's like third millennium, digitization. That's what was so scary about Y2K, I think, is it was like this internal insecurity about how we are handling technological change at the turn of the millennium. And I think there's no better example of this actually impacting our world than the fucking Scantron machines that are deciding the election. Like the pregnant Chads and the garage door Chads are technology just not quite being where we need it to be in the new digital era.
You can't Russian interference pencil and paper. I haven't voted in Canada for a long time, but the times that I have, I was just bubbling in a fucking oval. And I actually worked as a poll clerk one time, and we just did the first count by hand. Why do you need fucking machines? Don't rely on the machines.
Didn't the ancient Greeks just like throw shit at the person they wanted to vote for? So whoever was like covered in the most shit won. I remember reading that in a book somewhere. We should.
I don't think that's right.
But if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, but the David Foster Wallace book was good about that too, just showing us how technology is becoming at the standard that we have today, but just in like a much worse way.
Yet the wildest thing about the Wallace book is the Wallace and Gromit book. Sorry, I'm very tired.
David Foster Wallace and Gromit.
The wildest thing is that he talks about like John McCain gives the same stump speech every single time, but they have to keep filming it for the media. He gives the same town hall speech every fucking time, but he really stresses the thousands of man hours of labor that go into following the Straight Talk Express, that go into following this long shot failed campaign in which he's saying the same thing every day with thousands of dollars of technology coming along with you. Just like the huge business that is telecommunications and news media. I wanted to say one theme that's still with us, one theme echoed in the culture, whatever we want to call it. Since 2000, there has never been an election that everyone in America was like, yep, we got it. Easy peasy. 2004, there was some business with voting machines in Ohio. I don't really remember. 2008 was birtherism on Obama to make his presidency seem illegitimate. 2016 is Russiagate. 2020, the funnest one yet.
The mules.
Yeah.
The 2000 mules.
The mules, the packets, the Venezuelan hacking voting machine from a dead Hugo Chavez. There is never going to be an election that everyone accepts for all of the reasons that we've underlined over the past several hours. But for all the reasons we have identified, like the fact that the popular vote doesn't matter, the fact that it's run on a state-by-state basis, the fact that it's done on a county-by-county basis within those states, it's never gonna happen, dude. It's gonna keep being this shitty. And I, for one, can't wait for 2024.
I was not joking. I'm writing in Nader. I mean, my politics were definitely informed by two things around the year 2000. One was the band Leftover Crack, and they would use Michael Parenti sound bites in their songs.
Nice.
And the second one was that Rage Against the Machine video, and Ralph Nader gives a little sound bite at the end of it saying, like, if you don't turn on to politics will turn on to you. And yeah, man, like, it's not even a fucking choice anymore. Who am I going to vote for? That's crazy. It's crazy. Yeah. Even if my vote does count, which I don't think it does, who am I going to vote for?
I mean, I think we got to think about the biggest echo in the culture is the echoing voice of 1 million dead Iraqis that should be with us at heart.
Yeah, the screams.
Well, continue. Well, one more thing. So there was a law passed, I think, in 2002 that was meant to reinvigorate the American public's belief in our democracy. And I guess...
like the Safe Elections Act.
Not safe,
It introduced the idea of voter ID laws.
Yes, that helped a lot too. And yet, in 2018, in the state of Florida, we had something very similar happen. An incredibly close election. This was between Ron DeSantis and Andrew Gillum, whose campaign I kind of worked for and now seriously regret. It's one of my great marks of shame. And for those of you who have forgotten, Andrew Gillum, this was literally the week COVID started. He was at a wedding party in Miami and was found passed out naked with a gay prostitute from doing too many drugs in a hotel.
He's a meth fan, right?
The fun guy.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm not aware being a party animal was a crime in Miami.
Yeah.
Whomst amongst us. So that election was incredibly close. Also with Rick Scott, who he termed out of governor and ran against a popular Democratic senator, Bill Nelson, and that gave Florida like the red sweep with DeSantis. That election called for a recount. It was so close. There was a literal recount in the state of Florida. And I will also say, in the same fucking counties where this recount, fucking Miami-Dade and Broward, this same fucking shit happened. They closed the voting early, and the machine number, like the numbers didn't make any fucking sense. So they stole another election in the very same county. I don't know if you want to call that an echo, because it's... Maybe it's a little too generous to call it that. DeSantis won by, in the end, I want to say like 10,000 votes or something like that. Not a lot of votes. Dude, Florida's so fucked.
Yeah, it's funny. I watched like a shitty edutainment YouTube explainer from like Vox.com. Don't judge me. It very much was like, how did Florida turn so red? In 2000, it was a swing state that was basically a tie. The three theses they had were Republicans moved there during COVID, Cubans, as opposed to like Mexicans or Puerto Ricans or DR people, Cubans plus Venezuelans who have increasingly moved to Miami, very right-wing Latinos that the Republicans actively target, and then just the richest state Republican country in the nation. They failed to mention this thing you said, which was fraud, stealing elections.
Also, I had a fifth one, Ohio jet ski dealers and MLM fraudsters who got ran out of town and came down to Florida. Florida actually has a very funny law. My congressman, Vern Buchanan, from Ohio, I guess he was like in the printing business or something like that. Basically, he stole a bunch of money from his partners and spent all that money on property in Florida because there's a law that other states can't sue property owners in the state of Florida.
Yeah, it's why O.J. Simpson lived there.
We're kind of like Australia in that like they keep sending all the bad people to us. So that's part of the reason too. Oh, fucking Midwesterners who are all, in my opinion, fraudsters. No one else.
Yeah. If we want to move off to closing thoughts, I just might end with this idea of the end of history era. I think it's very of the time, the end of history theory, that people really thought we had found the perfect economic system, like a liberal democracy. And one of the pieces of evidence of that is that they had faith in this system when the Supreme Court magic box spat out that the guy who gave them their job's son was actually the winner of the election. And they were like, well, the checks and balances, they worked and we got Bush. So I don't think there was that much backlash against this election. I don't remember people really talking about it too much, other than the fact that it was maybe confusing. But yeah, I think that they had a lot of faith in the system due to this end of history moment that they were living in. And it's certainly one of the things that is gone now.
Dude, I remember people saying Bush v. Gore actually was a vindication for the system, because in other countries, you know what happens when an election's that close? Military coups, civil wars. But we didn't, thanks to our beautiful, perfect system. This was true lib-brain faith in the system shit. I want to tell one more story about a lib-brain motherfucker. I once overheard a stranger in New York, like a very boomery, middle-aged New Yorker, turbo lib, tried to say, because of the ambiguity for 36 days, they weren't able to start the presidential transition. And because of that backlog in starting the presidential transition, that left the security hole that directly led to 9/11, which is one of the worst takes I have ever heard. That 36-day thing that we're drawing a direct, perfect parallel to a thing that happened like almost a year later. That's something, yeah, only a fucking damn would think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, libs will be libs and right-wing assholes will be right-wing assholes. And one of the lib echoes from the 2000 election was blaming Ralph Nader.
Truth.
Even though my father voted for Nader, he did this thing where it was like you switch your vote. So it was like an honor system in a way where someone in Virginia, it's like, here, I'll vote for Gore if you vote for Nader, so that he can get past that, it was like that 5 million vote threshold so that the Green Party could get federal funding. But yeah, Nader was scapegoated by libs, and even to this day they do that. And then what happened in 2016? Like, Bernie is the reason we have Trump.
Yep. And Bernie wasn't even on the ballot in 2016. Let's be real. Ralph Nader, at least you could point and be like, oh yeah, politically these people are closer to Dems. They should have held their nose and voted for the Dem on the ticket. Bernie wasn't on the fucking ticket. He was just too mean to her. You're right, Isaac. I have heard libs blame Jill Stein voters.
Yeah, and so that remains. So Al Gore embodies this perfectly too, where it's just this feckless, pathetic, lib inability to look in the mirror and be like, this is politics. This is politics. This isn't an intellectual exercise. This is power. And if you truly believe that the other side is like bad and doing bad things, you should do whatever it takes politically to win.
It's all the more humiliating for him because he's Mr. Environmentalism, right? Your main thing is the environment. You're doing politics for the state of the planet.
Yeah, but do you really believe that with him? He did get busted for like having like an insane heated pool bill or something like that. And like,
oh, really?
He's like a Davos bitch, you know, just like flying jets all over the country. Like you guys should walk more. You know, it's like. It's crazy to me. I think that, okay, to talk about the dead Iraqis, sure. I do wonder, though, considering I think we all kind of agree this duopoly or whatever you want to call it, they're two sides of the same coin. As George Galloway says, two cheeks of the same ass. Would 9/11 have happened if Al Gore won? And that's something I like to think about.
I joked about this with Giordano in the lead up. Imagine in the alternate universe where almost everything is identical, but instead we say, Al Gore did 9/11. Nothing else has changed. It's just that.
I wonder. We used to think if Al Gore were president, we wouldn't have gone to war in Iraq. And now you see like the Democratic Party giving $100 billion to Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan. It's like, well, wouldn't he? Why not?
Yeah, it might just be like a Clinton-style triangulation where instead of invading Iraq ourselves, we just flood it with weapons and let it, let it destroy itself.
Yeah, the Democratic thing to do would have been to just knock down one of the towers, not both of them.
Yeah, we're meeting you in the middle.
Yeah.
It's called compromise, folks.
Yeah, I don't know. I like to imagine, and maybe I'm just still too idealistic about this, I would like to imagine that in the alternate universe where Gore wins, 9/11 still happens, because I'm not loose change pilled like Isaac here. But in my idealistic world, Al Gore does not go into Iraq.
Based on these books, I get the sense that 9/11 still happens, and then Al Gore has a nervous breakdown trying to figure out the puzzle of how to solve it, the problem, the terrific logical problem at hand.
Okay, well, here's the bit, and I'm gonna need Isaac to do the heavy lifting on the voice, Isaac and you, but it's Al Gore looking at the smoke billowing out of the towers. He just goes, "What a fascinating engineering problem," and he starts to. I need you to say, "Jet fuel can't melt steel beams."
Now you see that jet fuel that can't melt steel beams.
Yeah, Al Gore gets totally loose change pilled because he can't intellectualize it. What happened with Tower 7?
These are all good questions, but I think if you're as deep state pilled as I am, there were other interests at play. I'm almost at a loss of words to say. This has been a fun episode, but it's just bumming me the fuck out. This is such a bummer. It's such a bummer that this is, and again, this is why even though January 6th was done under the dumbest fucking shit, I have nothing but respect for anyone who would storm the Capitol. Yes, that's what we should all be doing, because do you see how fucking crazy this world is? So for all the fucking libs who were like, Donald Trump is going to create a nuclear holocaust, and so I'm going to put a fucking sign outside my house, and that's about as far as I'm going to go. It's like, yeah, fuck you, dude. I have zero respect for you in this house, motherfucker, and mad respect for that little old lady who had the looked lost in the Senate building, the little flag. take a shit on Nancy Pelosi's desk. That you
tase your own balls so hard you die.
Yeah. Yes, please. That would be way more effective than voting, honestly.
The modern day equivalent of the monk in Vietnam self-immolating is tasing your balls so hard your fucking type 2 diabetic ass has a heart attack and dies.
His name is like Tick Not Dong or something like that. Zap my dong.
If we're wrapping up, I want to close out by telling a story. And this actually does tie back to our kind of 50th episode retrospective. And we're starting with the election that kicked off the whole decade. Sometimes doing my nostalgia pod makes me kind of sad. It makes me feel like, am I always looking at the past? Am I terminally never in the present, never looking forwards? But then I think about the fact that the world actually hasn't changed at all. And I get even sadder. But the story that I want to tell is I was in San Francisco recently and I went on a walking tour. It's something I like to do when I'm visiting a place. And I found a walking tour that was the Haight Ashbury Flower Power walking tour. And I'm like, fuck yeah, give me some Summer of Love bullshit, right? Let's see what this is all about. And this tour was given by a woman who was a walking, talking anti-drug PSA because she could not think. She had done too much acid. She couldn't remember facts. She couldn't tell the story in order. She ran the San Francisco Psychedelics Museum, which was just a room in her living room. She took me into her living room, and it was just all of the hippie political hobby horses. She made me pull on a strand of hemp and then said, do you know what fiber that is that you just tugged on? Is it hemp? Like, how did you know? I said, how could I not? You motherfuckers will shut the fuck up about hemp. But yeah, sometimes I worry that I will become this woman, this person obsessed with this past period of time, person who won't let go of the struggle for hemp. The woman who made me watch a 15-minute Grateful Dead interview in her living room in which they talked about how bad the Vietnam War was. Like, that will be me. I don't have a joke here.
I was gonna say, but like instead of hemp, it's like Nickelodeon Gak or something. Like
Is it a hanging Chad?
Yeah.
Do you know what this is?
But no, all joking aside, I think it's worth looking back at the 2000s because of the fucking capital realism and because of our own period of stagnation. This stuff has not left. Bill Clinton is going to give another speech at another Democratic National Convention this fucking fall. Like, it's actually horrifying how little has changed. And apparently they're still stealing elections in Florida.
And not to mention the Democratic operative in charge of the recount, not in charge of, but who helped the recount, Ron Klain.
Oh, I know that name.
He was the White House chief officer for Biden from 2021 to 2023.
Oh, like chief of staff?
The chief of staff.
Oh.
The guy who fucking lost. The loser. The loser became the White House chief of staff, Ron Klain. You fail up in this country, man. And so I guess it works out for some people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, why don't we call it a wrap? Incredible stuff. We really appreciate it. I know it's a lot, you know, and Ben and I are regurgitating statistics at you. It can't be easy.
No, it's a pleasure talking to you guys. And I feel like we're in the same sort of ecosystem and we got to lift each other up, really. And you guys can quit your corporate jobs and I can stop selling drugs and...
Oh, yeah. Feel free to plug your show, by the way. So we went on Isaac's podcast recently. Hopefully you check that out. Well, Jon Stewart and Hauntology, which was just so amazingly prescient for our show. Like, it describes so perfectly what we talk about every single episode. We were talking about Jon Stewart, so specifically it was Jontology and how he will never leave us, apparently.
Yeah, I am your conspiracy acid-brained cousin or something like that. But yeah, as a kid who grew up in the 2000s, I love your show and I'm a dedicated listener. So thanks for having me on.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on. All right. As I always say, thank you so much for listening. Please like, please subscribe, please engage. Doesn't even need to be nice. Just farming the Al Gore rhythm on this one.
Yeah, it's our 2-year birthday. Do something nice for us.
Yeah. Take the $5 you would give us and just...
give it to me.
Yeah, give it to Isaac.
I have a Patreon.
He has a Patreon. He's legally allowed to be an entertainer. So.
Yeah.
All right, ciao, ciao. Ben here, just coming in after the fact on the edit. I just wanted to give a shout out to an old professor of mine. I've mentioned on this pod that I recently got a PhD, and a prof who taught me, who was on my dissertation committee, and for whom I was a teaching assistant, passed away the week we recorded this episode. I actually missed his funeral to record this episode of the podcast, and at the time I felt really guilty about it. So I wanted to do something nice for this guy in the form of a podcast shoutout. This prof's name was David Constant, and he was someone I'd known for almost a decade since we first met in October of 2015 at an academic conference. He was super important to me as a teacher, as a mentor, and as someone who read all of my work through grad school. He was an emeritus prof from Brown, but he was on PhD committees across the country at any one time because he was generous with his time like that. And maybe most importantly of all, though, he was a real deal New Yorker. This is a guy who grew up in a tenement on the Lower East Side, raised by folks whose first language was Yiddish. He once said to me that the only thing required to be a New Yorker was a deep and abiding love for the city of New York. And that's just a line that's really stuck with me. He was a legend. And I guess I'll just leave you with this one story that doesn't have anything to do with his teaching or his mentorship or his researching or his prolific publishing career as an academic. No, this is a story that was told at the David Constant funeral, according to a friend of mine. Apparently, when David set a date for his wedding, it conflicted with a vacation that his brother had already planned. And David told his brother, "If I see you at my wedding, I'll never speak to you again." Which is so perfectly David, and there's a certain nice poetic bow to it, in that I felt guilty for missing his funeral, and this was a story that was told at this man's funeral. I get the feeling he's the kind of guy who wouldn't have minded at all that I missed his funeral to record a podcast on an election that happened 25 years ago. Anyways, sorry to get real with y'all. This man was an absolute mensch whom I will miss a lot. Thanks. All right, I gotta fucking get on the train.
It's way past your bedtime.
Way past my bedtime. Rise and grind.
Rise and grinder.
Rise.
All right, fellas, I'll send you.
Hell yeah, man.
All right, see ya.
Peace.
In our town, we have a state attorney by the name of Janet Reno.
Come on, get it done. 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 Come on, get it done.
You think you're so sick that you won't have to pay? You slay, get it, baby, then run away. Oh, but I got a trick for your monkey ass. The boys who don't pay get case up fast. You ask the Janet Reno and she lays the law. And when she's through with you, you wish you never saw. Me or the baby or the place where you're mad, digging up old ghosts that you wish you could forget. The proof is here. It's living and breathing. And Janet Reno making sure that I start receiving all the money you get, all the checks you make. Janet Reno will make sure and take.